Sean Merriman. San Diego drafted Sean Merriman 12th overall in 2005, and he immediately delivered elite pass rushing production. He won Defensive Rookie of the Year and quickly became the focal point of the Chargers' defense. The lights-out persona, paired with his sack celebration and violent edge play, turned him into a national highlight staple. By 2006, he was operating at a pace that put him in position to challenge for the conference lead in sacks, making him far more than just a rising contributor. That trajectory shifted on October 22, 2006, when reports revealed he had been notified of a 4-game ban for violating the NFL's policy on steroids and related substances. His representatives argued the positive result came from a tainted supplement and identified nandrolone as the substance involved. Merriman initially appealed and continued playing during the review process, but on October 31st, he withdrew the appeal and began serving the suspension. The penalty forced him to miss 4 consecutive mid-season games, removing a defensive centerpiece during a critical stretch. The aftermath fueled even more debate. Despite missing time, Merriman finished 2006 with 17.5 sacks in just 12 games, enough to lead the entire NFL. He still earned first-team All-Pro honors, prompting league-wide discussion about how suspended players should be treated in award voting. The controversy led to a policy adjustment often referred to as the Merriman Rule, which barred players suspended under the steroid policy from Pro Bowl selection or major awards in that same season. The NFL did not simply discipline a star defender. It used the episode to reshape its incentive structure moving forward. Brian Cushing. Houston selected Brian Cushing with the 15th pick in the 2009 draft out of USC to anchor the middle of its defense. He delivered instantly, finishing his rookie season with 133 total tackles, 4 sacks, 4 interceptions, and a defensive touchdown while handling signal calling duties. That production earned him Defensive Rookie of the Year and positioned him as the central figure in the Texans' defensive structure. After one season, he looked like a long-term franchise linebacker with all-pro potential. The narrative shifted in May 2010 when the organization announced a 4-game ban for violating its performance-enhancing drug policy. Reports identified the substance as HCG, a hormone often referenced in anti-doping discussions because of its link to steroid cycle recovery. Immediately following his award-winning season, it intensified scrutiny. Cushing denied knowingly taking a banned enhancer and stated the substance was not a traditional anabolic steroid, arguing the result came from something he did not intentionally ingest. His appeal was denied, and the penalty was upheld, placing doubt over his breakout year. He returned and remained productive, recording multiple 100-tackle seasons, earning Pro Bowl recognition, and serving as a defensive captain. A torn ACL in 2012 and continued knee issues later in his career limited his availability. In September 2017, a second violation resulted in a 10-game disqualification, shifting the discussion from isolated controversy to repeat offense. Houston released him after that suspension, and from that point forward, his career achievements were consistently evaluated alongside the 2 PED cases that shaped public perception. Julian Edelman. Julian Edelman entered the division as a 7th-round pick in 2009 after playing quarterback at Kent State, but New England converted him into a wide receiver and special teams contributor. Over time, he developed into Tom Brady's most reliable postseason target, carving out a reputation for clutch playoff performances. By the end of the 2016 season, he had played a central role in multiple deep runs, including the dramatic comeback victory in Super Bowl 51. His trajectory pointed toward continued prominence within the Patriots' championship core. A torn ACL in the 2017 preseason sidelined him for the entire year, forcing a long rehabilitation process while New England reached another Super Bowl without him. Optimism surrounded his return in 2018, but that momentum shifted in June when the NFL announced a 4-match ban for violating its performance-enhancing drug policy. The timing intensified scrutiny because he was coming off major knee surgery, and the franchise already carried a history of controversy. Edelman appealed, stating the positive result stemmed from a contaminated supplement and that he never knowingly took a banned substance, yet the penalty was upheld. After serving the penalty, he returned in Week 5 of the 2018 season and quickly regained form heading into the playoffs. In Super Bowl 53, he recorded 10 receptions for 141 yards and earned Super Bowl MVP, delivering a defining performance in another championship victory. The sequence created a divided interpretation of his career. Supporters pointed to accountability followed by elite production, while critics incorporated the penalty into wider debates about the Patriots' era. Unlike other cases where discipline altered a trajectory, Edelman's legacy is framed as a redemption arc that includes both a violation and a Super Bowl masterpiece. Rodney Harrison. By 2007, Rodney Harrison stood as a defensive leader in New England, already holding 2 Super Bowl titles with the franchise and a reputation for physical play in high-stakes games. He was not a depth contributor, but a tone setter whose presence shaped the secondary. That status amplified the impact of what followed. When news surfaced just before the season that he had violated league policy, it landed as a major storyline rather than a minor roster note. His case differed from a standard positive test announcement. Reporting linked the penalty to admissions connected to a federal investigation involving performance-enhancing substances, with human growth hormone at the center of the violation. On August 31, 2007, the governing body issued a 4-game disqualification without pay, making him eligible to return in early October. The timing meant he missed the opening month of a season that quickly turned historic as the Patriots launched into what would become a 16-0 regular season. Harrison later framed his actions as related to injury recovery rather than competitive gain, highlighting the distinction players often attempt to draw between healing and enhancement, even though league policy does not separate the two. He returned after Week 4 and remained part of the defense during the playoff run, despite suspension lingering as a cloud over the campaign. The season concluded with the Super Bowl loss to the Giants, and Harrison was on the field for the defining helmet catch play, a visual that permanently ties his ineligibility year to both dominance and disappointment. Will Fuller. Houston selected Will Fuller with the 21st pick in the 2016 draft, banking on elite speed and vertical separation out of Notre Dame. Early flashes confirmed his big play ability, but repeated hamstring injuries limited his availability and prevented sustained momentum. In 2020, that pattern finally shifted. Through 11 games, he produced 879 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, and a career-high catch rate, emerging as the primary explosive option after DeAndre Hopkins departed. On November 30th, 2020, NFL announced a 6-match ban for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. The penalty erased the final 5 games of his most productive season and carried into the following year, eliminating the first game of 2021 as well. Fuller stated he trusted a medical professional who prescribed medication he believed was permitted and accepted responsibility for not independently verifying it. The ruling stood, and the timing proved costly because it struck during a contract year when he was positioned to capitalize on his surge. The fallout extended beyond missed games. Questions surfaced about whether his improved durability was connected to the violation, a narrative that followed him into free agency. He signed with Miami, but did not replicate the efficiency or impact of his 2020 stretch. His ban effectively froze his peak at 11 games, leaving his career arc defined as a breakthrough season, interrupted at the moment it reached full speed. Mark Ingram. New Orleans selected Mark Ingram with the 28th pick in 2011, and over time he developed into the power element of a dynamic backfield. By 2017, he had paired with Alvin Kamara to form one of the division's most productive running back duos, rushing for 1,124 yards and scoring 12 total touchdowns while earning Pro Bowl recognition. With Drew Brees still directing an explosive offense, the Saints were firmly in contention mode. Ingram was not a rotational piece, but a central figure in Sean Payton's offensive balance. In May 2018, the league announced a 4-game disqualification for violating its performance-enhancing drug policy, sidelining him for the opening month of the season. The ruling fell under the organization's strict liability standard, which places full responsibility on the player regardless of intent. Public details about the specific substance were limited, and Ingram did not publicly challenge the decision. The decision was final, forcing the Saints to begin a competitive year without their primary early down runner. His absence required early adjustments, including heavier reliance on Kamara and modified red zone usage until Ingram returned in Week 5. Although New Orleans still advanced to the playoffs, the interruption altered the rhythm of an offense built on balance. After the season, Ingram departed in free agency, and while his disqualification did not erase his accomplishments, it attached a lasting note to an otherwise strong stretch of production during the franchise's contention window. Jalen Ramsey. Jalen Ramsey entered the conference as the 5th overall pick in 2016 and quickly established himself as a shutdown corner capable of matching opposing top receivers. By 2017, he had earned first-team All-Pro honors and helped anchor a Jacksonville defense that reached the AFC Championship game. His brand centered on physical coverage, technical discipline, and vocal confidence in his status among the competition's elite. In 2019, during what should have been the height of that trajectory, a policy violation surfaced. In October 2019, shortly after a high-profile trade to the Los Angeles Rams that cost 2 first-round picks and additional draft capital, Ramsey received a 2-game ban for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. The moment intensified attention because he was adjusting to a new system while carrying the expectations of a franchise-altering acquisition. Ramsey stated the positive result stemmed from medication prescribed during an illness and maintained he did not knowingly take a banned substance. The NFL upheld the penalty, requiring him to miss games for his new team almost immediately after the trade. Ramsey's dismissal generated headlines, but did not derail his performance arc. Upon returning, he continued to operate at an elite level, earned further All-Pro recognition, and later secured a Super Bowl title with the Rams in the 2021 season. Aqib Talib. Aqib Talib entered the division in 2008 as a first-round pick and developed into a physical, instinctive corner known for tight man coverage and ball production. Stops in Tampa Bay, New England, and later Denver shaped his reputation as a tone setter in the secondary. By the early 2000s, he was widely recognized for matching up with top receivers and playing with visible edge and emotion. His aggressive style drew both praise and criticism, reinforcing an image that was equal parts elite and polarizing. In August 2013, shortly after signing a 1-year deal with New England, Talib received a 4-game suspension for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. This development mattered because he was expected to anchor the Patriots' secondary from the start of the season. This was not a depth loss, but the removal of a starting corner tasked with handling premier matchups. The match ban was served without a prolonged public dispute, though observers connected it to his broader reputation for on-field intensity and prior fines. He returned and continued performing at a high level, later signing with Denver and playing a central role in the championship defense that won Super Bowl 50. This did not stall his trajectory, but it became part of his disciplinary record and reinforced the narrative that controversy often followed him. In the context of his career, the violation reads as an interruption rather than a turning point, yet it remains attached to his prime years. Robert Mathis. By 2013, Robert Mathis had established himself as the defensive engine in Indianapolis, leading the competition with 19.5 sacks and anchoring a unit tasked with supporting a young franchise quarterback. His production placed him at the center of the Colts' defensive identity, particularly in late-game pass rush situations. When a 4-game dismissal was announced in May 2014 for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy, the announcement created immediate tension because it followed the most dominant statistical season of his career. The announcement triggered debate about how to interpret his league-leading sack total. Mathis explained that the violation stemmed from fertility treatment connected to his family plans, emphasizing that the situation was medical rather than competitive in nature. The NFL's policy, however, operates under strict liability standards, meaning intent does not override a prohibited substance finding. The decision was final, and public opinion split between those who viewed his prior dominance as legitimate and those who questioned it. From a football perspective, Indianapolis lost its primary edge rusher and defensive leader for the opening month of the season. Early schedule momentum often shapes playoff positioning, and missing 4 games affects rhythm, counting statistics, and narrative momentum. Even after returning, the arc of his season had shifted because his absence altered expectations and scrutiny levels. Von Miller. At the height of Denver's championship push, Von Miller stood as the defense's defining force. He was the edge rusher offense schemed around, and a foundational piece of a roster built to capitalize on Peyton Manning's window. Expectations were centered on a Super Bowl run, not a transitional year. When discipline was announced just before the 2013 season, it landed as a disruption to a title blueprint, rather than a routine roster setback. In August of that year, NFL handed Miller a 6-game suspension under the substance abuse policy. Reports clarified that the issue was not a standard failed test, but centered on violations tied to the testing and compliance process. The league initially pursued a longer penalty before settling on 6 games, signaling the seriousness of the matter. Public coverage referenced a diluted sample and procedural breaches, and later reporting connected the situation to attempted interference with the collection process, transforming the episode into a broader integrity discussion. Denver opened the season without its primary pass rusher, forcing schematic adjustments during a campaign framed as championship or disappointment. Miller issued a statement accepting responsibility and acknowledging there was no excuse for the violations, which became a defining response moment. Although he later returned to dominant form and delivered a historic postseason that culminated in a Super Bowl MVP performance, Miller's disqualification remained part of his narrative. Josh Gordon. Few receivers have burst onto the scene the way Josh Gordon did. Entering the league through the supplemental draft in 2012, he was viewed as a high-upside gamble. One season later, he led the NFL with 1,646 receiving yards, despite missing 2 games, including consecutive 200-yard performances that showcased rare explosiveness. At just 22, he looked like a franchise-altering weapon with the physical tools to dominate for a decade. His disciplinary history fell under the substance abuse policy rather than the performance-enhancing drug framework, a distinction that shaped how his case was discussed. An early 2-game disqualification in 2013 did little to slow his production, but a far more damaging penalty followed when he was sidelined for most of the 2014 season after another violation. Subsequent years brought indefinite disciplinary dismissals, reinstatements, and further setbacks, turning what first appeared to be a temporary issue into a recurring pattern. Each return generated optimism that his career could stabilize, particularly when he resurfaced with playoff contenders. However, sustained availability never materialized during what should have been his prime years. Gordon's story evolved into a conversation about addiction, policy rigidity, and unrealized potential. Aldon Smith. San Francisco invested the 7th overall pick in Aldon Smith in 2011, and the early returns were extraordinary. He recorded 14 sacks as a rookie, followed that with 19.5 in his second season, and became a driving force on a defense that reached the Super Bowl. At just 23 years old, he was tracking toward Defensive Player of the Year conversations and looked like a long-term pillar of an elite roster. Few young pass rushers in league history had opened their careers with that level of disruption. The turning point arrived in 2013 when he received a 5-game disciplinary dismissal under the substance abuse policy, removing the centerpiece of the 49ers pass rush during a contending season. Off-field issues soon expanded beyond league discipline, and included arrests, legal complications, and rehabilitation efforts. What began as a policy violation evolved into a broader crisis that affected his availability and standing with the organization. The conversation shifted from production to stability and from dominance to uncertainty. An indefinite suspension followed in 2014 after additional violations, effectively erasing what should have been his prime years. Later comeback attempts with other franchises generated optimism, but were repeatedly interrupted by further issues. His early pace suggested a trajectory toward historic recognition, yet repeated non-compliance and legal troubles reshaped that outlook entirely. Calvin Ridley. Atlanta selected Calvin Ridley with the 26th pick in 2018, and he steadily developed into the Falcons' primary receiving threat. A polished route runner with strong production, he posted 1,374 yards and 9 touchdowns in 2020 and entered the next phase of his career as the focal point of the offense. During the 2021 season, he stepped away from the team, citing mental health reasons, receiving public support at the time. No competitive controversy surrounded that absence until the following spring. On March 7, 2022, the league announced a full-season disqualification for violating the gambling policy after determining that Ridley had placed bets on NFL games during a 5-day period in November 2021 while away from the team. Some of those wagers involved the Falcons. The punishment was not partial or reduced. It covered the entire 2022 season. The organization's stance on betting related to its own games centers on preserving competitive integrity and public trust. And even though reports indicated the total wagered amount was relatively small, with no evidence of game manipulation, the maximum standard was applied. Ridley acknowledged the mistake publicly and stated the total amount wagered was $1,500, adding that he did not have a gambling problem. Atlanta lost its top receiver for a full year and eventually moved on, while Ridley missed a prime season before later reinstatement and a trade to Jacksonville. Jameson Williams. Detroit used the 12th overall pick in 2022 on Jameson Williams, banking on elite speed and vertical explosiveness to accelerate a rebuilding offense. He entered the division viewed as a long-term perimeter threat capable of stretching coverage and changing games with one play. The organization was constructing a young core, and Williams was expected to grow into a central figure within that plan. In April 2023, the league announced a wave of gambling-related discipline that included a 6-game ban for Williams. The key distinction was that he did not bet on NFL games. The violation stemmed from placing wagers on non-NFL sporting events while inside a team facility, which still violates league policy regardless of the sport involved. The rule focuses on location as well as subject matter, and that technical breach triggered the penalty. His suspension was later reduced to 4 games after NFL revised certain policy thresholds. The episode generated debate because the NFL actively promotes sports betting partnerships while maintaining strict internal compliance standards for players. For Detroit, this move delayed his early season development and chemistry within the offense. For Williams, it attached a gambling-related infraction to his name before he had fully established himself. Isaiah Rodgers. Isaiah Rodgers carved out value in Indianapolis as a versatile defensive back who also contributed on special teams, particularly in the return game. He was not a headline star, but he had secured a meaningful role and was trending upward within the roster structure. That upward trajectory stopped abruptly in June 2023. The league announced an indefinite temporary ban through at least the end of the 2023 season for violating the gambling policy, specifically tied to betting on NFL games. This category carries the most serious integrity implications under league standards. Unlike technical facility violations, wagering on NFL contests directly challenges the competitive trust the league aims to protect. Indianapolis released Rodgers the same day the discipline became public, signaling how quickly teams distance themselves from such cases. Even while suspended, he later received a contract from Philadelphia and was placed on the reserve list, effectively a future investment pending reinstatement. In April 2024, the NFL restored his eligibility. Rodgers indicated that bets were made from his account, but suggested he was not personally responsible for placing them. Yet the policy assigns accountability to the account holder. Quintez Cephus entered the conference as a mid-round selection for Detroit and showed flashes that hinted at long-term depth value. He was working to solidify a consistent role rather than operating with established star security. That context matters because players without firm footing often face steeper consequences when eligibility disappears. In April 2023, NFL handed out an indefinite disciplinary dismissal for violating the gambling policy, and team statements referenced betting on NFL games. That classification places the violation in the most severe integrity category under league rules. Detroit released him shortly after the announcement, demonstrating how organizations respond swiftly when wagering on league contests is involved. An indefinite ban extends beyond missed games. It removes practice time, game film accumulation, and competitive rhythm while the roster continues to evolve without the player. Although he was reinstated in April 2024 and later signed with another team for an opportunity to compete, reinstatement guarantees only eligibility, not status. Cephus's case illustrates how quickly career momentum can dissolve when trust is compromised, and how difficult it can be to reclaim a foothold afterward. Shaka Toney was a young edge rusher in Washington, working to establish himself through rotational snaps and special teams work. He was not entrenched as a starter, which made development time essential to his trajectory. Players in that tier rely on steady reps and visible growth to secure roster stability. Any extended absence carries amplified consequences because there is little margin for interruption. In April 2023, the league issued an indefinite disqualification through at least the end of the 2023 season for violating the gambling policy. The classification placed the violation in the category tied to betting on NFL games, which triggers the harshest disciplinary standard. League reporting emphasized that the review found no evidence of compromised games or manipulated outcomes. Even so, the policy centers on protecting competitive integrity and public trust, meaning proof of direct impact is not required for severe discipline. An indefinite year removes practice access, game film opportunities, and roster leverage, while replacements fill the depth chart. Toney was reinstated in April 2024 as part of a broader group decision, but Washington released him days later. Eligibility returned, yet organizational trust did not. La'el Collins entered 2021 as an established starting offensive tackle, a position built on reliability and trust. Offensive line continuity shapes protection schemes and quarterback stability, making availability central to team planning. That context magnified what followed because the issue was not framed around a routine positive test. Instead, the spotlight moved to the testing process itself. In September 2021, reporting revealed that Collins received a 5-game disqualification after an incident involving an attempt to influence a drug test collector. The distinction matters. Most disciplinary cases revolve around substances detected in a sample, but this case centered on alleged interference with enforcement procedures. The Federation treats efforts to avoid or manipulate testing as serious violations because the credibility of the program depends on the integrity of collection and compliance. His appeal did not overturn the decision, and everything remained intact. From a competitive standpoint, losing the starting tackle for 5 games disrupts protection communication and offensive rhythm. Beyond the immediate absence, the narrative impact lingered because attempted interference raises broader questions about intent. Even without public confirmation of any specific banned substance, the attempt to influence the process became the defining element. Lane Johnson. Philadelphia selected Lane Johnson 4th overall in 2013 to anchor the right side of its offensive line. He quickly developed into a high-level protector, entrusted with shielding the quarterback and stabilizing protection schemes. Offensive tackles rarely dominate headlines, yet they shaped the ceiling of an offense through consistency and durability. Johnson was positioned as a foundational piece in a roster attempting to construct long-term contention. A 4-game ban in 2014 for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy interrupted his second season. At the time, it was framed as an early career misstep, and he served the penalty without extended public dispute. The situation escalated in 2016 when a second violation resulted in a 10-match ban, a far more severe consequence under league policy. Missing more than half a season placed strain on offensive line continuity and intensified scrutiny because repeat violations trigger heightened skepticism. Johnson later spoke openly about supplement use and aspects of the league's testing framework, though the discipline remained unchanged. He returned to elite form, earned multiple All-Pro honors, and played a central role in Philadelphia's Super Bowl 52 victory. Patrick Peterson. Patrick Peterson entered the division as the 5th overall pick in 2011 and built a reputation as a technically refined corner with consistent production. Multiple Pro Bowl selections and All-Pro recognition reinforced his standing as one of NFL's premier defensive backs. He was widely regarded as disciplined and professional, with little controversy attached to his profile. That context magnified the reaction when discipline was announced. In May 2019, the league issued a 6-game disciplinary action for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. The absence covered the opening stretch of the season and removed Arizona's top coverage defender during a critical period. Length suspension carried weight because it signaled a serious violation rather than a minor infraction. For a defense built around his ability to match elite receivers, the loss required schematic adjustments and accelerated responsibilities for younger players. Peterson did not mount a public confrontation with NFL and served the punishment before returning to the lineup. His career continued, yet the episode altered how his resume is discussed. Prior to 2019, he was described primarily through performance and reliability. Antonio Gates. Antonio Gates entered professional football as an undrafted free agent who transitioned from basketball to tight end, eventually redefining red zone efficiency at the position. Over the years, he accumulated Pro Bowl honors and climbed the touchdown leaderboard, establishing himself among the most productive tight ends in league history. By 2015, he was nearing 35 and chasing milestone records that would cement his legacy. In July 2015, the league announced a 4-game temporary ban for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. Losing the opening month of the season meant fewer opportunities to accumulate touchdowns and reinforce his standing in historical comparisons. For a veteran operating on limited remaining seasons, each missed game carried amplified significance. Gates stated that he did not knowingly take a banned substance and accepted responsibility without escalating the dispute publicly. Upon returning, he scored 5 touchdowns and continued his climb up the all-time list before eventually retiring with Hall of Fame credentials. Julius Peppers. Carolina selected Julius Peppers 2nd overall in 2002, drawn to a rare blend of size, length, and explosiveness that projected franchise-altering impact. He justified that belief immediately, overwhelming blockers and collecting Defensive Rookie of the Year honors. His pass rush ability translated from day one, confirming that he was more than a workout marvel. Momentum, however, met resistance before the season concluded. In November of his rookie campaign, the league handed out a 4-game disqualification under the substance abuse policy after a banned substance was detected. Peppers stated the result stemmed from an over-the-counter supplement, yet the discipline remained in place. Debate followed, given that it followed a dominant debut season. Questions surfaced about whether his early production would now be viewed differently, even though the suspension covered only a portion of that year. What followed reshaped the narrative. Peppers returned and constructed a career defined by sustained excellence, multiple All-Pro selections, and more than 150 sacks. He did not encounter additional PED controversy, and over nearly 2 decades, his play anchored the discussion around his legacy. DJ Humphries. Arizona drafted DJ Humphries in 2015 with the expectation that he would secure the left tackle position long-term. Early seasons featured inconsistency and injury setbacks, yet persistence eventually stabilized his role. By 2019, he was protecting a rookie quarterback and operating in a contract year, placing heightened importance on late-season performance. For a blindside protector, reliability directly influences organizational confidence and market value. In December 2019, the league announced a 4-game disciplinary action against Humphries for violating the performance-enhancing drug policy. The moment carried weight because it removed him during the closing stretch of the season, limiting evaluation opportunities during negotiations. A late-season absence for a starting tackle forces protection adjustments and can affect offensive cohesion. The violation also introduced reputational considerations tied to strength and durability at a physically demanding position. Despite the setback, Arizona signed him to a multi-year extension shortly after the season ended. That decision signaled internal belief in his long-term value, even with what was going on at the time being on record. The episode remains part of his career timeline, yet it did not derail his standing within the organization. Orlando Scandrick. Orlando Scandrick entered the division in 2008 and developed into a dependable member of Dallas's secondary. He offered versatility by aligning both inside and outside, providing coverage flexibility rather than headline recognition. Through the early part of the decade, his value rested on steadiness and adaptability. That foundation framed the reaction when discipline emerged. Ahead of the 2014 season, the league imposed a 4-game suspension under the performance-enhancing drug policy. An early season absence for a starting defensive back forces immediate adjustments in coverage assignments and depth rotations. For a veteran relying on quickness and recovery speed, the public conversation often centers on physical maintenance and competitive longevity. Orlando's removal was served without extended public confrontation. Scandrick returned and continued contributing for several seasons, later moving on to additional teams. He did not develop a pattern of violations, yet the incident remains attached to his professional record. Le'Veon Bell. Pittsburgh built its mid-2000s offense around Le'Veon Bell's versatility, pairing his patience as a runner with elite receiving ability out of the backfield. He functioned as the tempo controller within a unit featuring Ben Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown, and his presence dictated defensive alignments. When he was unavailable, the structure of the offense changed noticeably because few backs could replicate his workload balance. A 2-game disqualification in 2015 for violating the substance abuse policy interrupted early season plans, even after an appeal reduced the original penalty. The following year brought a 4-match ban under the same policy, shifting perception from isolated mistake to recurring issue. The absences arrived during a period when Pittsburgh viewed itself as a legitimate title contender, and early season disruption carried playoff implications. Debate intensified because the violations were tied to marijuana at a time when league thresholds were stricter than modern standards. The larger consequence centered on reliability. Each disqualification raised questions about availability during critical stretches, complicating long-term negotiations and roster planning. Bell eventually held out in 2018 amid contract disputes and later departed, never fully recapturing his Pittsburgh production elsewhere. Chandler Jones. Chandler Jones established himself as a consistent edge threat soon after entering the competition, producing double-digit sack totals and commanding extra protection attention. His move to Arizona elevated his profile further, positioning him as the focal point of a defense built around pressure. Expectations centered on him anchoring that unit without interruption. A 4-game suspension in 2016 under the substance abuse policy altered the opening portion of his season. Although not framed publicly as a performance-enhancing drug case, the absence of a premier pass rusher forces schematic recalibration and increases strain on coverage units. It coincided with a transition phase in his career, heightening scrutiny because he was expected to provide an immediate impact. Jones returned and delivered dominant production, eventually leading the league in sacks and earning All-Pro recognition. Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice's career stands as the statistical benchmark for wide receivers, defined by precision routes, conditioning, and record-breaking totals in yards and touchdowns. His accomplishments span championships and individual dominance across multiple eras. For years, his resume carried little controversy. Long after retirement, Rice acknowledged using stickum, an adhesive substance applied to hands or equipment to improve grip. The NFL banned such substances in 1981, and while usage had been common before the prohibition, post-ban application constituted a rules violation. Rice suggested widespread use during his era and minimized its impact. Yet, the admission reopened debate about competitive advantage and enforcement consistency. No retroactive penalty followed, but perception shifted in some circles. Supporters argue that cultural norms of the time dilute the significance, while critics question whether banned assistance should alter how records are viewed. Lester Hayes. Lester Hayes built his reputation as a physical corner who excelled in press coverage and ball production. During his tenure with the Raiders, he became as recognizable for interceptions as for the visible adhesive on his arms and hands. His association with stickum was widely noted during broadcasts, making him the face of that practice. When the league prohibited foreign adhesive substances in 1981, enforcement aimed to standardize equipment conditions and eliminate grip advantages. Hayes had been the most conspicuous user, leading to the informal labeling of the prohibition as the rule bearing his name. Although he did not receive a modern-style penalty for stickum, the ban marked a shift in how equipment manipulation was treated. Hayes' story represents a transitional era in league regulation. What was once commonplace became a violation as standards evolved. His connection to the adhesive debate highlights how cultural practices can shift into integrity concerns once formal rules change. Brian Cushing. Years after his initial disqualification, Brian Cushing remained a veteran presence in Houston, though injuries had reduced his explosiveness. As younger defensive talent emerged, he occupied more of a leadership and rotational role. The stage was set for scrutiny because of his prior disciplinary history. In September 2017, the league imposed a 10-game suspension for another performance-enhancing drug violation. The severity reflected repeat offender status under league policy and removed him for most of the season. Unlike his earlier case, which generated debate about circumstances, the second violation narrowed public sympathy and reinforced the perception of pattern rather than anomaly. Houston released him after he served his time, effectively closing his chapter with the franchise. Achievements such as Defensive Rookie of the Year and multiple Pro Bowl appearances remain on record, yet the second violation reshaped how his peak seasons are discussed. Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett had developed into Cleveland's defensive cornerstone, combining elite athleticism with consistent sack production. As a former first overall pick, he represented the franchise's defensive identity and was ascending toward award-level recognition. His trajectory shifted abruptly during a nationally televised divisional matchup in 2019. Late in that game, a confrontation escalated after a sack, culminating in Garrett removing an opponent's helmet and striking him with it. The visual of a helmet used as a weapon drew immediate attention and condemnation. NFL responded with an indefinite exclusion lasting at least through the end of the season, marking one of the most severe on-field disciplinary actions in recent history. Garrett's appeal did not shorten the penalty, and he missed the remainder of the regular season. Upon reinstatement, he returned to elite form and continued building a case as one of the division's premier pass rushers. The incident stands as a singular but defining controversy, illustrating how a moment of violent misconduct can coexist with sustained professional excellence. Buffalo Bills versus New England Patriots. The rivalry originated in 1960 when both franchises were charter members of the AFL East. From inception, it carried annual repetition, regional weather challenges, and divisional consequences. Buffalo found early success, capturing AFL championships in 1964 and 1965, while New England struggled for similar footing in that decade. When the merger formalized the AFC East in 1970, The scheduling continuity preserved the competitive thread. Control fluctuated over time. Buffalo surged in the early 1990s, reaching 4 consecutive AFC title games, while New England experienced instability. A dramatic turning point arrived in 2000 to 2001 with the arrival of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady. Over the next 2 decades, New England captured 17 division titles and 6 Super Bowls, dominating the head-to-head ledger. For much of that stretch, Buffalo's postseason aspirations were directly tied to overcoming a Patriots team that rarely yielded ground. Repeated late-season contests often sealed divisional outcomes in Foxborough, compounding frustration in Buffalo. The rivalry carried a psychological dimension. New England's sustained control shaped the competitive landscape of the AFC East. Even when margins were narrow, outcomes frequently favored the Patriots, reinforcing the imbalance. A reset began after the 2019 season. With Brady's departure and Josh Allen's emergence, Buffalo reclaimed divisional authority. The January 15, 2022 wildcard game, a 47-17 Bills victory, featuring touchdowns on every offensive drive, symbolized a shift in hierarchy. The rivalry now spans distinct eras: Buffalo's AFL dominance, New England's dynasty, and a modern recalibration that has restored competitive equilibrium. Miami Dolphins versus New York Jets. The roots of this rivalry trace back to 1966, when Miami entered the AFL East and joined a division that already included New York, then operating under the Titans name before rebranding as the Jets. From the outset, the pairing carried built-in repetition: 2 meetings every season, direct influence on standings, and contrasting environments: humid South Florida versus the chill of the Northeast. When the merger formalized the AFC East in 1970, the annual structure remained intact. Consistent exposure breeds familiarity, and familiarity often turns competitive tension into something sharper. During the 1970s, Miami established divisional authority under Don Shula, highlighted by the undefeated 1972 campaign and consecutive championships. New York, despite its Super Bowl III triumph in 1968, struggled to sustain comparable momentum in that decade. Yet head-to-head contests rarely felt routine. Divisional knowledge narrowed margins, and pride within the AFC East prevented the series from becoming ceremonial, even when overall records diverged. Momentum swings and late-game drama elevated the rivalry's emotional profile. On October 23, 2000, New York erased a 30-7 fourth-quarter deficit and secured a 40-37 overtime victory in a contest later remembered as the Monday Night Miracle. The collapse embedded itself in Miami memory, while energizing Jets supporters. Earlier, on September 21, 2008, Miami unveiled its Wildcat formation in a 38-13 victory that reshaped its season trajectory and disrupted New York's preparation. Innovation introduced against a division opponent carries symbolic weight. Through the 2000s and into recent seasons, playoff implications have frequently hovered around these meetings. Wildcard positioning and tiebreaker calculations have often depended on the outcome, even during periods when another AFC East franchise controlled the division. Quarterback transitions on both sidelines have altered tone, yet physical defensive play remains consistent. New York Jets versus Buffalo Bills. The rivalry began in 1960 when both franchises were charter AFL members sharing the same division. Annual meetings in Northeast conditions established structural permanence from day one. Buffalo claimed AFL championships in 1964 and 1965, while New York secured Super Bowl III following the 1968 season. Division placement determined postseason access in that era, granting regular season meetings direct championship significance. Through the 1980s and 1990s, competitive windows on both sides kept outcomes relevant. Buffalo's early 1990s ascent contrasted with periodic Jets playoff appearances, and head-to-head results often influenced wildcard calculations. Even during New England's later dominance of the division, Jets-Bills matchups retained tiebreaker importance and frequently shaped secondary playoff paths. Overtime contests in the late 1990s and early 2000s underscored how thin the margins could be. Divisional splits complicated seeding scenarios, amplifying the value of each meeting. In 2015, both teams entered late-season play with postseason hopes alive, and direct results influenced qualification outcomes. Survival, not supremacy, often defined the stakes. In recent seasons, Josh Allen's emergence elevated Buffalo's standing, while the Jets' defensive emphasis has produced competitive, tightly contested games. December conditions in Western New York frequently compress scoring and magnify line play. New England Patriots versus New York Jets. The tension between these franchises began at the AFL's launch in 1960, when the Boston Patriots and New York Titans entered as charter members. Regular divisional meetings created early familiarity, while the Boston-New York market contrast injected natural regional friction. For decades, the series carried competitive undertones without dominating national headlines. Both organizations cycled through uneven stretches, yet proximity ensured that contests rarely felt neutral. The foundation was laid early. The emotional explosion would come later. The rivalry escalated in the mid-1990s through leadership upheaval. Bill Parcells guided New England to Super Bowl 31, only to depart after the 1996 season and accept the Jets' head coaching position. His exit sparked disputes over contract language and draft compensation, turning divisional tension into executive conflict. What had once been routine competition transformed into organizational resentment. The stakes extended beyond the field, embedding mistrust between front offices. A second shock followed on January 4, 2000. Bill Belichick was introduced as the Jets' head coach, only to resign a day later, famously scribbling, "I resign as HC of the NYJ," before accepting the Patriots' position. That sequence altered the rivalry's trajectory. When Tom Brady ascended in 2001, New England established prolonged control of the AFC East, capturing division titles and building a dynasty. One notable interruption occurred in the 2010 divisional round, when the Jets defeated a 14-2 Patriots team, 28-21, behind quarterback Mark Sanchez and head coach Rex Ryan, delivering a rare postseason setback. Additional layers reinforced hostility. The 2007 Spygate investigation originated after a Week 1 Patriots-Jets contest, resulting in league discipline and amplifying suspicion in New York. Ryan's outspoken criticism of Belichick intensified media attention from 2009 through 2011, turning press conferences into extensions of the rivalry. Coaching defections, dynasty imbalance, controversy, and playoff implications combined to shape the AFC East narrative for 2 decades. Baltimore Ravens versus Pittsburgh Steelers. Baltimore's arrival in 1996 immediately altered the division's tone. Pittsburgh had already built its reputation on toughness and discipline, and the Ravens stepped into that environment carrying similar traits: industrial city pride, defensive emphasis, and territorial intensity. When the AFC North formed in 2002, the scheduling cemented the hostility. Annual home-and-home clashes, late-season cold, and standings frequently hanging in the balance. The friction didn't simmer. It surfaced quickly once Baltimore proved it could compete on equal footing. The early 2000s turned this matchup into a collision of philosophies built on stopping power. Baltimore's 2000 championship defense set a benchmark for controlled aggression, while Pittsburgh's scheme thrived on disguised pressure and opportunistic playmaking. Scores were often compressed, possessions limited, and space scarce. Yardage had to be earned. Nothing came easy. The physical demand of these games made them feel heavier than typical divisional contests. January 18, 2009, pushed the rivalry onto a larger stage. With a Super Bowl berth at stake, Pittsburgh secured a 23-14 victory, punctuated by Troy Polamalu's decisive interception return. The elimination reinforced the emotional stakes. 2 seasons later, another postseason meeting ended the same way. Baltimore sent home after a narrow defeat. Consecutive playoff endings tied directly to each other deepened the psychological layer and national visibility. Balance eventually returned. Baltimore's championship run in the 2012 season restored equilibrium, and later years introduced stylistic shifts as Lamar Jackson's mobility tested Pittsburgh's defensive structure. Despite evolving rosters, the essentials remained: narrow margins, divisional consequences, and games that routinely hinge on a single possession. Cincinnati Bengals versus Cleveland Browns. In 1968, Paul Brown, architect of Cleveland's original powerhouse, founded Cincinnati after being dismissed by the Browns' ownership 5 years earlier. Establishing a new franchise only hours away was intentional. Geography ensured regular friction, and legacy ensured emotion. When the merger placed both clubs in the AFC Central in 1970, annual meetings were guaranteed. The narrative was layered from the start: former visionary versus original city institutional memory versus new ambition. Ohio divided along football lines. Competitive cycles in the 1970s and 1980s added substance. Cincinnati reached Super Bowls following the 1981 and 1988 seasons, while Cleveland assembled strong playoff rosters under Bernie Kosar during the same era. Division races often required navigating through the other side of the state. National headlines might have focused elsewhere, but inside the AFC Central, positioning frequently hinged on these contests. The rivalry matured through stakes rather than spectacle. The 1995 relocation of the Browns to Baltimore interrupted continuity. For several seasons, the pairing disappeared entirely, only to resume in 1999 when Cleveland re-entered as an expansion organization. The reset altered balance. Cincinnati possessed relative continuity, while the Browns reconstructed infrastructure. Through the 2000s, both teams endured instability marked by coaching turnover and quarterback churn. Even during losing seasons, head-to-head meetings influenced draft order, spoiler roles, and divisional pride. Renewed energy surfaced with the arrivals of Baker Mayfield in Cleveland and Joe Burrow in Cincinnati. Simultaneous quarterback investment restored offensive intrigue and elevated expectations. Recent seasons have produced sweeps in both directions, reinforcing competitive unpredictability. Stylistically, Cincinnati has often leaned toward vertical passing in peak periods, while Cleveland has emphasized defensive backbone and physical ground play. Cleveland Browns versus Baltimore Ravens. Few divisional matchups originate from franchise relocation, and that singular event defines the emotional core here. In 1995, Cleveland's ownership announced a move to Baltimore, igniting civic outrage and legal confrontation. The resolution preserved the Browns' name, colors, and records in Ohio, while the relocated organization began play as the Ravens in 1996. Cleveland re-entered competition as an expansion club in 1999. The result created an unusual dynamic. One city retained history, the other retained personnel continuity. Each annual meeting reopens that wound. Baltimore established immediate credibility through defensive dominance. Anchored by Ray Lewis and a historically stingy unit, the Ravens captured Super Bowl 35 following the 2000 season. Cleveland, rebuilding from expansion status, struggled to match that standard. Early seasons tilted decisively toward Baltimore, reinforcing frustration in Ohio. The competitive imbalance did more than shape standings. It deepened resentment tied to the relocation narrative. Divisional realignment in 2002 placed both teams in the AFC North, guaranteeing biannual encounters with playoff implications attached. Over time, the competitive landscape shifted. Cleveland's 10-6 campaign in 2007 signaled temporary resurgence, while Baltimore recalibrated for another sustained run. A dramatic chapter unfolded on December 14, 2020, when the Ravens defeated the Browns 47-42 in a nationally televised thriller. Lamar Jackson exited briefly before returning to convert a crucial fourth-down touchdown, sealing a result that carried postseason consequences and renewed national focus. Recent seasons have featured higher scoring and quarterback-centric dynamics, moving beyond purely defensive trench battles. Baltimore's organizational stability contrasts with Cleveland's periodic rebuild cycles, yet emotional intensity remains constant. Pittsburgh Steelers versus Cincinnati Bengals. Divisional tension between these two formed in the 1970s, when league restructuring placed both franchises in the AFC Central. Pittsburgh quickly constructed a dynasty under Chuck Noll, capturing 4 Super Bowls during that decade. Cincinnati fielded competitive rosters, but could not consistently overcome the standard set within its own division. That imbalance established the psychological framework. Defeating Pittsburgh represented more than a tally in the win column. It symbolized progress against the benchmark of sustained excellence. The emotional weight intensified on January 8, 2006. Hosting a wildcard game as division champion, Cincinnati appeared positioned to reassert itself. Early in the contest, Carson Palmer completed a deep pass and suffered a torn ACL on the same play following contact from Kimo von Oelhoffen. Momentum shifted immediately. Pittsburgh secured a 31-17 victory and eventually claimed the Super Bowl. For Cincinnati supporters, the sequence felt like a championship opportunity collapsing in a single snap. Another rupture followed on January 9, 2016. Leading late in a tightly contested wildcard meeting, Cincinnati seemed poised to end a lengthy postseason drought. A turnover and consecutive personal foul penalties against Bengals defenders moved Pittsburgh into field goal range. The resulting kick delivered an 18-16 elimination. On-field altercations, suspensions, and post-game exchanges amplified hostility. That night crystallized accumulated frustration and defined the rivalry's modern volatility. Physical identity sustains intensity. Pittsburgh's blitz schemes and linebacker tradition contrast with Cincinnati's aggressive secondary and emotional edge. Meetings often feature heavy contact and sideline confrontation. Joe Burrow's emergence has recently shifted competitive balance, highlighted by Cincinnati's sweep in 2021 and subsequent Super Bowl appearance. Indianapolis Colts versus New England Patriots. The defining AFC storyline of the 2000s centered on 2 quarterbacks, Peyton Manning in Indianapolis and Tom Brady in New England. From 2001 through 2010, conference supremacy almost always flowed through Foxborough or Indianapolis. Regular season meetings carried playoff seeding consequences, and January often forced the franchises into collision. Their contrasting styles sharpened the intrigue. Manning's pre-snap orchestration against Brady's situational efficiency. As both organizations stacked double-digit win seasons, the AFC bracket repeatedly narrowed to these 2 powers. Early postseason chapters leaned heavily toward New England. In the 2003 AFC Championship game, the Patriots secured a 24-14 victory, disrupting Manning's rhythm with physical coverage and timely pressure. The following year brought another setback for Indianapolis, a 20-3 defeat in the 2004 divisional round. Those losses cemented a perception that the Colts possessed regular season brilliance but struggled to clear the Patriots' hurdle. Each elimination intensified scrutiny and built anticipation for the next encounter. The narrative pivoted on January 21, 2007. Trailing 21-3 in the AFC Championship game, Indianapolis mounted a dramatic comeback to win 38-34. Manning's second-half execution reversed years of frustration and propelled the Colts toward a Super Bowl 41 title. That evening reframed the rivalry as balanced rather than one-sided. Instead of inevitability, the matchup evolved into a heavyweight exchange where momentum could swing decisively. Subsequent meetings added strategic and off-field layers. On November 15, 2009, New England faced 4th and 2 from its own 28-yard line late in the 4th quarter. Head coach Bill Belichick opted to go for it. The attempt fell short, and Manning capitalized with a game-winning drive in a 35-34 result. In the 2014 AFC Championship game, a 45-7 Patriots victory preceded the Deflategate investigation, after Indianapolis raised concerns about football inflation levels. Jacksonville Jaguars versus Tennessee Titans. Jacksonville's arrival in 1995 introduced a new divisional variable, but the emotional charge intensified once the Houston Oilers relocated to Tennessee in 1997 and later adopted the Titans' identity in 1999. Placement together in the AFC Central and subsequently the AFC South after the 2002 realignment locked the franchises into recurring competition. Unlike rivalries that simmer gradually, this one accelerated rapidly. Structural alignment created familiarity. Circumstance created hostility. The defining rupture occurred during the 1999 campaign. Jacksonville finished 14-2, the strongest regular season in franchise history. Both defeats came against Tennessee. The teams collided again in the AFC Championship game on January 23, 2000, where the Titans secured a 33-14 victory and advanced to the Super Bowl. 3 losses to the same opponent ended an otherwise dominant Jaguars year. That sequence embedded a narrative of obstruction, with Tennessee cast as the recurring barrier to Jacksonville's breakthrough. In the years that followed, stylistic similarities reinforced intensity. Both organizations leaned into defensive fronts and power-based rushing attacks. Contests frequently unfolded as controlled trench struggles marked by field position shifts and turnover swings rather than aerial fireworks. The emphasis on physical control over pace or spectacle shaped the rivalry's texture. It carried weight without theatrical flourish. A renewed chapter emerged during the prime of Derrick Henry. His 238-yard, 4-touchdown performance in Week 14 of the 2018 season against Jacksonville became one of the most dominant individual displays in series history. Subsequent 130-plus yard outings in later seasons reinforced Tennessee's ground game identity while directly influencing AFC South positioning. For Jacksonville, containing Derrick Henry evolved into a symbolic benchmark: Houston Texans versus Tennessee Titans. The franchise, now known as the Titans, began as the Houston Oilers before moving to Tennessee in 1997, leaving Houston without an NFL presence until the Texans debuted as an expansion club in 2002. When the league placed both organizations in the AFC South, the schedule immediately revived dormant resentment. For many in Houston, contests against Tennessee represented more than standings. They symbolized confrontation with a former identity operating elsewhere. The first meeting on September 15, 2002, delivered a defining statement. In only their second regular season appearance, the Texans secured a 24-10 victory over Tennessee. The result carried symbolic weight: an expansion roster defeating the city's departed franchise. That afternoon offered validation that Houston's return would not function as a mere placeholder. Pride resurfaced through competition rather than nostalgia. Competitive balance during the 2000s, however, leaned toward Tennessee. The Titans reached the AFC Championship following the 2002 campaign and maintained playoff viability for much of the decade, while Houston searched for organizational stability. Each Tennessee surge served as a reminder of what the Oilers once represented in Texas. The contrast between sustained competitiveness in Nashville and developmental seasons in Houston intensified frustration among Texans supporters. Division stakes sharpened in the late 2000s when both rosters matured into contenders. Houston featured defensive anchor, while Tennessee built its identity around the power running of Hen. In the 2019 season finale, Henry's 211-yard, 3-touchdown performance clinched the rushing title and secured a playoff berth, reinforcing Tennessee's physical imprint on the rivalry. Tennessee Titans versus Indianapolis Colts. When the Houston Oilers moved to Tennessee in 1997, later adopting the Titans name in 1999, the franchise entered a shared competitive space with Indianapolis inside the AFC Central. The 2002 divisional restructuring cemented annual home and away meetings within the AFC South, transforming periodic competition into structural permanence. Regional contrasts between Indianapolis and Nashville added subtle cultural friction, and consistent proximity ensured that playoff positioning would frequently hinge on head-to-head outcomes. Though modern in origin, the pairing accelerated quickly because both rosters matured into contenders within the same window. Tennessee established early authority. The 1999 campaign culminated in a Super Bowl appearance, and the early 2000s featured steady postseason participation. Indianapolis, meanwhile, was assembling its future around Peyton Manning. As Manning entered his peak years, competitive gravity shifted north. From 2003 through 2010, the Colts captured multiple division titles, while Tennessee remained within striking distance. Meetings during that span often determined seeding and wildcard pathways, especially when margins between first and second place were narrow. Balance reached its apex in 2007 and 2008. Tennessee surged to a 13-3 record and secured the conference's top seed in 2008, while Indianapolis finished 12-4. An October 2008 primetime victory by Tennessee over the Colts fueled a 10-0 start and signaled parity at the top of the division. Rather than a chase dynamic, those seasons presented elite versus elite competition, where both organizations advanced to the postseason, and postseason leverage intensified regular season encounters. Transitions reshaped momentum, but preserved relevance. Manning's departure in 2012 briefly altered the trajectory, yet Indianapolis quickly stabilized under Andrew Luck. Later, Derrick Henry's dominant stretch from 2019 through 2021 reframed stylistic contrast. Tennessee emphasized power rushing, while Indianapolis invested in defensive front strength. Late-season clashes in 2016 and 2019 directly redirected playoff qualification routes. Denver Broncos versus Kansas City Chiefs. Professional hostility between these franchises began in 1960 as charter members of the American Football League. Kansas City, then operating as the Dallas Texans before relocating in 1963, found competitive footing quickly, capturing multiple AFL titles and eventually winning Super Bowl IV. Denver's early seasons were far less successful, with postseason qualification not arriving until 1977. The imbalance shaped initial perception, yet shared divisional placement guaranteed annual friction. Geography within the AFC West ensured that uneven beginnings would eventually mature into sustained competition. Competitive equilibrium developed as Denver surged in the late 1970s and accelerated further after John Elway's arrival in 1983. His presence transformed the Broncos into consistent conference contenders. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, AFC West positioning frequently hinged on these meetings. Kansas City fielded disciplined defensive units that emphasized pressure and field control, while Elway delivered late-game drives that preserved Denver's divisional leverage. Rather than one-sided dominance, the era reflected contested hierarchy, where postseason routes were often shaped by head-to-head outcomes. Environmental contrast added a strategic dimension rarely duplicated elsewhere. Arrowhead Stadium's crowd volume and winter conditions created communication challenges and momentum swings. Denver's mile-high environment introduced altitude-based conditioning demands that visiting rosters had to manage carefully. Tactical preparation differed dramatically depending on venue, and weather frequently influenced game tempo. These structural differences intensified the competitive edge beyond personnel matchups alone. Power shifted again in the 2010s. Peyton Manning's arrival in 2012 propelled Denver to 5 consecutive division titles, re-establishing control before Kansas City's ascent under Patrick Mahomes redefined the AFC West hierarchy beginning in 2018. The Chiefs secured conference championships and multiple Super Bowl appearances, constructing a sustained winning streak over Denver during a transitional period for the Broncos. Los Angeles Chargers versus Kansas City Chiefs. The Chargers, originally based in Los Angeles before relocating to San Diego, quickly became an offensive force and captured the 1963 AFL Championship. Kansas City, then the Dallas Texans before moving in 1963, steadily built toward contention, eventually winning Super Bowl IV after the 1969 season. Regular meetings in the AFL Western Division often carried playoff consequences, giving the series competitive gravity well before the merger unified the leagues. A stylistic contrast defined the late 1970s and early 1980s. Under Don Coryell, San Diego unleashed a vertical passing attack that stretched defenses deep and wide. Kansas City countered with disciplined defensive groups built on structure and physical containment. These games felt like philosophical debates played out on grass, downfield aggression versus controlled resistance. Even in seasons without conference supremacy, AFC West positioning frequently shifted based on these results. The mid-1990s brought a brief period of simultaneous contention. Kansas City leaned on playoff-caliber defenses, while the Chargers advanced to Super Bowl 29 following the 1994 season. Later, LaDainian Tomlinson's dominance in the 2000s reignited tension, as his production often dictated divisional outcomes. Philip Rivers sustained competitiveness for Los Angeles, and numerous matchups influenced wildcard paths and tiebreaker scenarios. Close finishes and momentum swings became defining characteristics. Another transformation began in 2018 when Patrick Mahomes took control in Kansas City. Conference titles and Super Bowl victories followed, establishing sustained authority in the AFC West. Los Angeles responded by developing Justin Herbert, renewing the quarterback duel dynamic. The December 13, 2018 thriller, decided by a late two-point conversion in a 29-28 Chargers victory, demonstrated how narrow the separation remains. Kansas City versus Las Vegas Raiders. In 1960, the Chiefs began as the Dallas Texans under Lamar Hunt, while the Raiders took shape in Oakland and later reflected the assertive philosophy of Al Davis. Their conflict extended beyond rosters. Hunt and Davis disagreed on merger strategy, league governance, and expansion direction, shaping contrasting visions for professional football. That executive friction filtered directly into competition, giving the series a sharper edge than most early divisional pairings. The first major rupture arrived on December 29, 1968, when Oakland defeated Kansas City 41-6 in the AFL Championship game. The result eliminated the Chiefs from title contention and elevated the Raiders' stature within the league hierarchy. Kansas City's subsequent Super Bowl IV triumph in the following season did little to soften that blow. Postseason elimination leaves longer scars than regular season setbacks. From that point forward, meetings carried memory rather than simple standings implications. Following the 1970 merger, permanent placement in the AFC West intensified identity contrast. Oakland cultivated vertical aggression and defensive intimidation, while Kansas City leaned into structural consistency and the intimidating atmosphere of Arrowhead Stadium. Games in the 1970s and beyond featured physical exchanges and emotional reactions that fueled supporter hostility. The rivalry extended beyond players to venue culture, with Arrowhead's noise and the Coliseum's black hole creating atmospheres that magnified every possession. Modern chapters preserved intensity. In 2020, a Raiders victory at Arrowhead prompted a celebratory bus lap that Kansas City later answered with a 40-9 response, illustrating that pride remains central. The ascent of Patrick Mahomes further shifted competitive balance, placing the Chiefs atop the division while challenging Raiders tradition. Las Vegas Raiders versus Denver Broncos. During the 1970s, Oakland established conference authority, capturing Super Bowl XI after the 1976 season. Denver, meanwhile, steadily climbed toward relevance, reaching its first Super Bowl following the 1977 campaign. Divisional encounters in that period often carried implications beyond pride. They influenced postseason pathways and AFC West hierarchy. The balance was rarely static, and supremacy shifted through performance rather than reputation. The 1980s and 1990s introduced quarterback-centered drama. John Elway's arrival in 1983 intensified stakes, especially in late-game scenarios that became synonymous with his career. Oakland maintained its defensive edge and rugged identity, producing confrontational, trench-heavy contests that rarely lacked edge. Sideline friction and tight margins reinforced emotional investment on both sides. Power swings continued into the 2000s, with the Raiders reaching Super Bowl 37 after the 2002 season, before Denver reclaimed divisional relevance in subsequent years. Even in seasons without championship overlap, the atmosphere rarely softened. Traveling fan bases, cultural contrast between the silver and black brand, and Denver's altitude-driven home advantage, and 6 decades of shared division history sustain tension. Philadelphia Eagles versus Dallas Cowboys. From the moment Dallas entered the league in 1960 as an expansion franchise placed in the NFL's Eastern Conference, friction formed instantly. Sharing a division meant frequent meetings, but proximity alone was not the spark. The tension centered on perception and influence. Dallas promoted itself as America's team, crafting a nationwide brand built on visibility and marketing reach. Philadelphia, rooted in a blue-collar sports culture, rejected that framing entirely. One side leaned into polish and national spotlight. The other embraced toughness and defiance. That philosophical divide shaped every interaction that followed. The rivalry escalated dramatically in January 1981 during the NFC Championship game at Veterans Stadium. Dallas secured a 20-7 victory, halting Philadelphia's path to what would have been its first Super Bowl appearance. For Eagles supporters, that defeat carried lasting emotional weight. It represented more than postseason elimination. It symbolized opportunity taken away on home soil. After that afternoon, regular season meetings no longer felt routine. Every clash carried echoes of that championship denial. During the 1990s, hostility intensified as both organizations fielded legitimate contenders. Dallas captured multiple Super Bowl titles behind Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin, establishing conference dominance early in the decade. Philadelphia responded with a punishing defensive identity that later featured Brian Dawkins as an emotional anchor. In 1999, a defining moment unfolded when Irvin suffered a career-ending neck injury at Veterans Stadium. As he lay motionless, some in the crowd applauded. That reaction drew national scrutiny and reinforced how combustible this matchup had become. Respect between fan bases eroded further. The animosity expanded beyond rosters into symbolic gestures and high-stakes finales. Terrell Owens intensified matters after starring in Philadelphia's 2004 Super Bowl run, then signing with Dallas in 2006 following a contentious departure. His celebration on the Cowboys' midfield star after scoring against his former team added another chapter of resentment. On the field, late hits, sideline confrontations, and division-deciding games sustained the temperature. The 44-6 Philadelphia victory in Week 17 of 2008, which eliminated Dallas from playoff contention, remains a defining humiliation in Cowboys history. More recently, playoff-caliber rosters in 2022 and 2023 restored national focus to the rivalry. Dallas Cowboys versus San Francisco 49ers. Although both organizations carried championship credibility by the late 1970s, true hostility crystallized in the early 1980s. San Francisco, guided by head coach Bill Walsh, engineered an offensive transformation built on timing, spacing, and precision. Dallas entered that decade with established national stature and a resume of consistent postseason appearances. The intersection of innovation and tradition set the stage for confrontation. Everything accelerated when the two met for the NFC crown following the 1981 season. The defining sequence arrived in that championship matchup. With under a minute remaining, Joe Montana rolled to his right and lofted a high pass toward the back corner of the end zone, where Dwight Clark elevated for the now iconic touchdown known as the catch. San Francisco secured a 28-27 victory, ending Dallas's grip on conference supremacy and signaling a new hierarchy. That single moment launched a dynasty for the 49ers while abruptly halting the Cowboys' late 1970s momentum. The outcome resonated far beyond the final score. It reshaped the NFC's power structure. Intensity escalated further in the early 1990s when postseason pathways repeatedly forced the franchises into direct collision. From 1992 through 1994, they faced one another in 3 consecutive NFC Championship games. Dallas claimed the first 2 encounters, powered by turnovers and explosive playmaking, before San Francisco retooled its roster and responded in 1994 to reclaim conference authority. Figures such as Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith represented Texas' strength, while Steve Young symbolized West Coast execution. For 3 straight seasons, the conference title effectively required defeating the other. After a lengthy pause in playoff meetings, the rivalry resurfaced in the modern era. San Francisco eliminated Dallas in the 2021 wildcard round following a dramatic final sequence involving clock management, then repeated the result in the 2022 divisional round. The emotional aftermath from both fan bases underscored how deeply rooted the animosity remains. With 5 NFC Championship clashes, multiple Lombardi trophies tied to these encounters, and one of the most replayed moments in league history, this rivalry has repeatedly determined who controls the conference. New York Giants versus Philadelphia Eagles. The roots of this feud stretch back to the league's early decades. New York entered professional football in 1925. Philadelphia followed in 1933, and for generations, they shared the same Eastern Division structure that later evolved into the NFC East. Unlike rivalries born from relocation disputes or coaching betrayals, this one is anchored in geography. 2 densely populated Northeast cities, separated by only a short stretch of highway, developed parallel football cultures shaped by intense media scrutiny and uncompromising fan bases. The tension reflects civic identity as much as standings. A defining rupture occurred on November 19, 1978. With seconds remaining and holding a late lead, New York attempted a routine handoff rather than kneeling. The exchange failed, the ball hit the turf, and Philadelphia defensive back Herman Edwards returned it for a touchdown in a 19-17 outcome, later labeled the Miracle at the Meadowlands. The impact extended beyond heartbreak. Teams across the league adopted the kneel-down formation to prevent similar collapses. One play altered strategy and permanently embedded humiliation into rivalry memory. Physicality defined the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Giants built disciplined, championship-caliber rosters under Bill Parcells, while the Eagles assembled aggressive defensive fronts that punished opposing quarterbacks. Meetings rarely felt artistic. They were trench-driven, low-scoring affairs where field position mattered more than flair. That simmering hostility escalated on January 7, 2001, when New York defeated Philadelphia 20-10 in the NFC Championship game, ending the Eagles' season one step from the Super Bowl and intensifying January resentment. The rivalry reached another emotional apex on December 19, 2010. Leading 31-10 in the fourth quarter, the Giants watched Philadelphia score 28 unanswered points, culminating in Deshaun Jackson's walk-off punt return after a brief bobble. The scene became known as the Miracle at the New Meadowlands, a second chapter of collapse trauma layered onto the first. New York's Super Bowl 46 victory the following season provided symbolic counterbalance, yet the cycle of humiliation and retaliation persists. Washington Commanders versus Dallas Cowboys. When Dallas received an expansion franchise in 1960, Washington's owner resisted the move, opposing another club encroaching on what he viewed as his regional territory. The league proceeded anyway, placing the Cowboys in the same division. From inception, friction existed at the ownership level. That origin matters because disputes rooted in power and market control rarely fade with time. Competition intensified in the 1970s when both organizations reached championship caliber simultaneously. Washington, guided by head coach George Allen, assembled a veteran-driven contender. Dallas, anchored by quarterback Roger Staubach, evolved into a perennial title threat. Their clashes in the 1972 and 1982 NFC Championship games resulted in Washington victories, each one ending Dallas's season. Elimination games create deeper scars than routine divisional contests, and these January defeats cemented lasting resentment. The rivalry gained additional dimension through branding and identity. Dallas embraced the America's Team moniker, projecting national reach and commercial appeal. Washington historically asserted control of the Mid-Atlantic football landscape, cultivating a loyal regional following. When both teams surged again in the early 1990s, Washington claiming Super Bowl 26th and Dallas capturing 3 titles in a 4-season span, the NFC picture frequently ran through one or both. Large fan bases amplified every result, turning wins into statements and losses into civic frustration. Modern chapters reinforce that history still influences present stakes. In Week 17 of the 2012 season, Washington secured the NFC East by defeating Dallas 28-18 behind rookie quarterback Robert Griffin III, ending the Cowboys' campaign. Even during the uneven 2020 season, late-year meetings carried playoff implications despite modest records. That persistence illustrates the rivalry's durability. Green Bay Packers versus Minnesota Vikings. When Minnesota entered the league in 1961, divisional alignment immediately paired it with nearby Green Bay, creating a yearly home-and-home that felt more like a state line argument than a scheduling coincidence. The first meeting on October 22, 1961, ended in a 33-7 Packers victory, setting an early tone. From that point forward, proximity ensured familiarity, and familiarity fueled tension. Wisconsin versus Minnesota pride became inseparable from the football itself, turning autumn Sundays into regional score-settling events. The opening phase leaned heavily toward Green Bay. Under Vince Lombardi, the Packers captured 9 of the first 10 meetings during Minnesota's first 5 seasons. That imbalance shaped the rivalry's psychology. The Vikings were not simply chasing wins, they were attempting to dethrone an established power led by a coach who defined professional excellence in the 1960s. Early frustration forged a competitive edge that lingered long after Lombardi's tenure concluded. Momentum shifted in the 1970s when Minnesota matured into a conference contender under Bud Grant. With disciplined defense and playoff appearances that included multiple Super Bowl trips, the Vikings asserted control for extended stretches. This reversal matters because it prevents the narrative from becoming static. The rivalry mirrors league-wide power cycles. When one franchise ascends, the other adjusts. That oscillation sustains long-term relevance and keeps historical arguments alive across generations. Toward the crowd. A moment broadcast toward the crowd. A moment broadcast nationally and replayed whenever the teams meet. That postseason victory intensified hostility by combining elimination with spectacle. Weeks earlier, on December 24, 2004, Green Bay had secured a 34-31 triumph via a last-second field goal from Ryan Longwell, directly shaping division standings. Chicago Bears versus Green Bay Packers. Chicago, originally known as the Decatur Staleys before relocating, held early organizational stability when Green Bay secured entry into the NFL. Initial cooperation between Packers founder Curly Lambeau and Bears leader George Halas eventually gave way to competitive friction. Halas once assisted Green Bay during financial instability, yet as both franchises strengthened, goodwill dissolved into competitive tension. From that transition forward, each contest carried institutional pride rather than simple divisional stakes. During the league's formative decades, championship positioning frequently flowed through these meetings. Chicago commanded the 1930s and 1940s under Halas's leadership, establishing a reputation for structured, disciplined football. Green Bay later asserted control in the 1960s under Vince Lombardi, redefining professional standards and capturing multiple titles. The 1961 NFL championship game crystallized that power shift when the Packers secured a 37-0 victory over Chicago, a result that signaled a new hierarchy. These cycles of supremacy elevated the rivalry beyond geography and into league-wide relevance. Momentum shifted again in the 1980s when Chicago assembled its ferocious 1985 defense, led by Walter Payton and Mike Singletary. That unit imposed physical control across the league and frequently dictated outcomes against Green Bay. The trajectory altered in the 1990s once Brett Favre assumed command in Wisconsin. Favre accumulated a 22-10 record against Chicago, re-establishing Packers' authority within the division. Although competitive balance tilted, emotional intensity persisted regardless of standings. The modern defining chapter unfolded in January 2011 when Green Bay defeated Chicago 21-14 in the NFC Championship game at Soldier Field, sending the Packers toward a Super Bowl title. Aaron Rodgers later extended that period of control through late-game precision and consistent division-clinching performances. Even with stretches of imbalance, generational loyalty sustains the rivalry's depth. With more than 200 meetings, Hall of Fame figures on both sidelines, and roots predating the Super Bowl era, Packers-Bears remains anchored in legacy. Detroit Lions versus Green Bay Packers. The rivalry began in the 1930s when the Lions, then operating as the Portsmouth Spartans before relocating to Detroit in 1934, regularly faced Green Bay in battles for Western Division positioning. In that era, divisional success often determined championship access, so these meetings carried substantial consequences. The Packers captured multiple league titles during the 1930s and 40s, while Detroit constructed competitive rosters that translated into championships in the 1950s. Long before the Super Bowl era, this pairing already influenced the league's balance of power. The 1960s introduced a pronounced shift. Under Vince Lombardi, Green Bay established itself as the standard of excellence, claiming 5 championships in 7 seasons and winning the first 2 Super Bowls. Detroit remained competitive in stretches, but the Packers dictated the division's hierarchy. Wisconsin held the upper hand, and the gap during that period shaped long-term perception within the matchup. Thanksgiving added a recurring national platform. Because Detroit hosts annually, Packers-Lions games often unfold under holiday spotlight, amplifying stakes regardless of record. Cold weather trench play, emotional crowd energy, and divisional implications frequently intersect on that stage. The ritual element reinforces continuity, ensuring the rivalry resurfaces in prime viewing windows year after year. Later decades introduced quarterback eras that extended Green Bay's leverage. Brett Favre controlled much of the 1990s and early 2000s, while Aaron Rodgers sustained that advantage in the 2010s, including dramatic finishes such as the 2015 Hail Mary that intensified frustration in Detroit. Yet competitive windows emerged behind Matthew Stafford, and more recent seasons have signaled renewed balance. Minnesota Vikings versus Chicago Bears. Minnesota entered the league in 1961 and immediately found itself measured against an established power. Their first meeting on October 22, 1961, ended in a 33-7 Chicago victory, reinforcing the gap between a legacy franchise and an expansion roster still building its foundation. Early seasons reflected that imbalance. Chicago carried decades of institutional strength. Minnesota carried urgency and ambition. Divisional placement ensured 2 meetings every year, turning what began as a lopsided introduction into a recurring proving ground. The 1970s reversed expectations. Under head coach Bud Grant, the Vikings evolved into a consistent NFC contender, reaching 4 Super Bowls and asserting themselves as more than a temporary expansion story. Chicago, meanwhile, struggled to maintain stability during much of that decade. The shift altered the rivalry's psychology. Minnesota was no longer chasing relevance. It was competing for supremacy. Beating Chicago became less about upset potential and more about affirming divisional authority. Momentum swung again in 1985 when the Bears assembled one of the most dominant defenses in league history, led by Mike Singletary and Richard Dent. Chicago swept Minnesota that season on the way to a Super Bowl championship, demonstrating how divisional control can shape postseason trajectory. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the rivalry adopted a cyclical rhythm. One team surged while the other disrupted. The 2009 campaign added emotional complexity when Brett Favre, long associated with a different NFC North rival, led Minnesota to a 12-4 record and an NFC Championship appearance, including 2 wins over Chicago. Recent seasons continue to attach tangible consequences to these meetings. In Week 17 of the 2018 season, Chicago defeated Minnesota 24-10 to secure the NFC North title, while eliminating the Vikings from playoff contention. Games with division crowns on the line compress decades of history into a single afternoon. New Orleans Saints versus Carolina Panthers. Carolina's arrival in 1995 introduced a new Southern presence into the league, and early divisional alignment placed the Panthers alongside New Orleans. When the NFC South formed in 2002, the pairing became permanent. The cultural contrast added texture. New Orleans carries deep Gulf Coast tradition and decades of history, while Carolina represents a newer, rapidly growing football market. At first, the meetings were built on repetition rather than hostility. That tone changed once divisional positioning began riding on the results. The early 2000s established competitive instability within the NFC South. No single franchise maintained prolonged control. Tampa Bay, Carolina, New Orleans, and Atlanta each claimed division titles during that stretch. Because margins were often slim, head-to-head outcomes between the Saints and Panthers regularly shaped playoff qualification. Late-season matchups frequently carried postseason consequences, turning routine scheduling into elimination pressure. Intensity escalated during the quarterback-driven stretch from 2011 through 2017. Drew Brees elevated New Orleans into a sustained contender with high-volume offensive production, while Cam Newton's arrival in Carolina injected athletic dynamism and MVP-level performance. Their contrasting styles created compelling duels, and season series often split in tightly contested games. Emotion on the field mirrored the stakes in the standings, particularly during seasons when both teams contended simultaneously. The rivalry crossed a new threshold on January 7, 2018, when New Orleans defeated Carolina 31-26 in the wild card round. It marked their first postseason meeting, and the Saints' defensive stand on Carolina's final drive sealed elimination. Earlier division-deciding clashes, such as Carolina's late-season surge in 2013 and its 15-1 campaign in 2015, had already layered tension into the series. The playoff confrontation cemented it. Atlanta Falcons versus New Orleans Saints. Professional football reached the Deep South in consecutive years, with Atlanta beginning play in 1966 and New Orleans following in 1967. Immediate divisional alignment ensured frequent contact, and geography accelerated friction. Interstate highways connect the two cities within hours. Recruiting territories overlap, and regional pride runs deep across Louisiana and Georgia. Competitive resentment did not require playoff drama to form. Repetition alone built familiarity, and familiarity sharpened dislike. Every autumn meeting carried civic undertones that extended well beyond the standings. For much of the 1970s and 1980s, sustained championship success eluded both organizations. Yet poor records rarely softened intensity. When postseason hopes were absent, bragging rights filled the void. Supporters measured seasons not solely by wins and losses, but by whether the neighboring state was beaten. That emotional currency preserved the edge during decades when national relevance fluctuated. Pride, not trophies, fueled investment. Structural permanence arrived with the 2002 divisional realignment, which placed both clubs in the newly formed NFC South. Annual home and away meetings now directly influenced playoff routes. The rivalry's profile expanded dramatically once quarterback stability emerged. Drew Brees elevated New Orleans into perennial contention beginning in 2006, and Atlanta responded with Matt Ryan 2 years later. From 2008 through the late 2000s, head-to-head outcomes frequently shaped division titles, wildcard berths, and postseason positioning. Late-season leverage reinforced the hostility. On December 27, 2012, Atlanta secured the conference's top seed with a 23-13 victory over New Orleans, underlining how these contests could determine January pathways. Upsets added volatility. Even when one roster appeared superior, outcomes rarely felt predictable. Carolina Panthers versus Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Carolina's arrival in 1995 introduced a new Southeastern presence, while Tampa Bay had already endured 2 decades of uneven results since 1976. Their relationship hardened once the 2002 divisional restructuring locked both into the NFC South. Annual meetings gained consistent weight, especially with Charlotte and Tampa separated by manageable travel distance and overlapping recruiting territories. Familiarity intensified competition, and repetition gave the pairing rhythm. Over time, structure replaced coincidence, turning sporadic tension into scheduled consequence. The early years of the NFC South were defined by volatility. Division champions changed frequently, and no organization sustained prolonged control. That instability elevated every head-to-head clash because even modest records could produce postseason qualification. In 2003, Carolina surged to a Super Bowl appearance, while Tampa Bay was still defending a recent championship pedigree. That simultaneous competitiveness forged respect mixed with urgency. Late-season contests during that stretch frequently carried bracket implications rather than symbolic bragging rights. Momentum shifted again during Cam Newton's prime. From 2013 through 2015, Carolina secured 3 consecutive division titles and produced a 15-1 campaign that culminated in a Super Bowl berth. Tampa Bay, navigating roster transitions, occasionally disrupted that ascent despite uneven records. The dynamic recalibrated dramatically in 2020 when Tom Brady arrived in Florida. Tampa Bay swept Carolina and captured a Lombardi trophy, tilting authority southward and reframing divisional hierarchy. Stylistic contrasts reinforce intrigue. Carolina traditionally emphasizes defensive front strength and quarterback mobility, while Tampa Bay has alternated between vertical passing and pressure-oriented defensive schemes. Turnover margins and trench performance often dictate outcomes. Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus New Orleans Saints. The Buccaneers debuted in 1976 and the Saints in 1967. Yet their connection lacked permanence until 2002. Divisional reshuffling that year grouped Tampa Bay and New Orleans together in the newly formed NFC South alongside Atlanta and Carolina. Annual home-and-home scheduling transformed occasional meetings into routine collision, tying both franchises to identical standings math within the Southeast Corridor. What had once been incidental became structurally unavoidable. The timing amplified tension immediately. Tampa captured the division in that inaugural NFC South season and rode a dominant defense to a Super Bowl 37 title. Establishing authority in the division's first year created an early pecking order, placing the Buccaneers ahead while New Orleans worked to close the gap. Initial imbalance in a fresh alignment often lingers in memory, and that first impression shaped perception for years. Everything intensified in 2006 when New Orleans paired Drew Brees with head coach Sean Payton. The Saints transitioned from instability to sustained contention, built on rhythm passing and offensive precision. Regular meetings now carried stylistic contrast, disciplined quarterback timing against Tampa's defensive aggression. Extended stretches where New Orleans repeatedly prevailed added a psychological layer, turning routine scheduling into a mental hurdle for Tampa supporters. The rivalry reached its modern apex during the 2020 season. After New Orleans swept the regular season series, Tampa reversed the narrative in the divisional round, winning 30-20 and ending Brees' tenure. That postseason elimination reshaped the balance of power and propelled the Buccaneers toward a Super Bowl 55 championship. Los Angeles Rams versus San Francisco 49ers. When San Francisco transitioned from the AAFC into the NFL in 1950, it immediately shared space with the Rams, creating a Northern versus Southern California axis. The contrast extended beyond uniforms. Los Angeles carried entertainment industry visibility and metropolitan scale, while the Bay Area projected resilience and industrial toughness. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Western Conference positioning frequently hinged on their head-to-head results. Long before the Super Bowl era shaped national narratives, these contests revolved around territorial pride and control of the state's football spotlight. Competitive cycles reshaped the balance over the decades. During the 1980s, San Francisco surged under Bill Walsh, with Joe Montana and Jerry Rice defining a championship standard that the Rams struggled to match. Momentum later shifted at the turn of the millennium, when the Rams, then in St. Louis, unveiled the explosive Greatest Show on Turf, led by Kurt Warner, capturing Super Bowl 34 and reversing the competitive script. That exchange of dominance deepened the rivalry's historical weight. Each era left a contrasting imprint on the division's hierarchy. The strategic dimension sharpened again with the arrival of Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan. Both architects emphasize offensive creativity and adaptive play design, turning meetings into schematic duels. San Francisco's 6-game regular season winning run over Los Angeles prior to the 2021 postseason created a psychological storyline that hovered over every snap. Even during the Rams' eventual Super Bowl campaign, the 49ers secured a Week 18 victory to clinch a playoff berth, reinforcing the sense of unfinished business between the two staffs. That tension culminated in the NFC Championship game on January 30th, 2022. Hosting at SoFi Stadium, Los Angeles trailed 17-7 before rallying behind Matthew Stafford to secure a 20-17 victory, punctuated by a late interception that sealed advancement. The triumph carried layered meaning. It ended San Francisco's recent streak, propelled the Rams into a Super Bowl held in their own venue, and reframed the competitive narrative. Add in frequent instances of 49ers supporters filling large sections of SoFi, and the rivalry's atmosphere gains another dimension. San Francisco 49ers versus Arizona Cardinals. Permanent structure arrived with the 2002 divisional realignment that locked both franchises into the NFC West. Annual meetings created predictable scheduling tension, but early years lacked sustained national significance. Competitive windows did not initially overlap, and division leadership rotated. Gradual familiarity built underlying friction, setting the stage for escalation once both sides aligned in performance cycles. Arizona's breakthrough during the 2008 season, culminating in a Super Bowl appearance, temporarily established control while San Francisco navigated a rebuilding phase. Momentum reversed when Jim Harbaugh assumed leadership in 2011. The 49ers evolved into a physical defensive force with repeated playoff participation. Head-to-head contests during that stretch often influenced division positioning and postseason access. Competitive equilibrium returned between 2013 and 2015. San Francisco maintained trench dominance, while Arizona surged behind Carson Palmer to a 13-3 campaign in 2015. That season included a series sweep by the Cardinals en route to an NFC Championship appearance, demonstrating cyclical balance rather than permanent hierarchy. Strategic contrast, power running and tempo control versus spread concepts and quarterback mobility added tactical intrigue. A modern illustration occurred on October 31, 2019, when San Francisco required overtime to secure a 28-25 victory against a rebuilding Arizona roster led by rookie Kyler Murray. The narrow margin underscored closing gaps within the division. Seattle Seahawks versus Los Angeles Rams. The modern version of this rivalry took shape during the NFL's 2002 divisional realignment, when both franchises were locked into the NFC West permanently. At that point, the Rams were still associated with the explosive Greatest Show on Turf legacy, while Seattle was stabilizing under head coach Mike Holmgren. Early meetings carried divisional importance, but lacked national intensity. That tone shifted once postseason windows began overlapping in the following decade. From 2012 through 2015, Seattle surged behind head coach Pete Carroll and the Legion of Boom defense, capturing Super Bowl 48 and returning the next season. Yet, during that same stretch, the Rams, then in St. Louis, proved to be a consistent obstacle. Even while rebuilding, they delivered physical, low-scoring contests that disrupted Seattle's pursuit of uncontested division control. The tension came not from dominance, but from resistance. The Seahawks expected authority. The Rams repeatedly complicated it. Late-season implications deepened the rivalry's competitive weight. In 2014, Seattle's seeding ambitions encountered rugged Rams performances that influenced postseason momentum. The series adopted a trench-driven character, with defensive pressure and field position often dictating outcomes. That physical edge transitioned into a tactical dimension when Sean McVay became head coach in 2017. His offensive innovation forced schematic adjustments, turning meetings into strategic duels rather than purely physical clashes. The defining postseason chapter unfolded on January 9, 2021, when Los Angeles defeated Seattle 30-20 in the wild card round. Despite quarterback uncertainty for the Rams, their defense controlled the game and eliminated the Seahawks on their home field. That outcome marked the first Super Bowl-era playoff meeting between the two and elevated the rivalry beyond routine division battles. Arizona Cardinals versus Seattle Seahawks. The modern version of this rivalry took shape in 2002 when league realignment placed Arizona and Seattle in the newly structured NFC West. Although the Cardinals franchise carries decades of history, sustained tension with the Seahawks did not truly form until divisional permanence created annual consequences. Regular two-game cycles gradually built familiarity, but competitive relevance arrived later. The series matured once both organizations assembled playoff-caliber rosters in the 2000s. Seattle's rise under head coach Pete Carroll established a defensive benchmark. The Legion of Boom secondary anchored a team that controlled the division during its Super Bowl window. Arizona responded with a contrasting formula under Bruce Arians, pairing vertical offense with quarterback Carson Palmer's efficiency. Between 2013 and 2016, both franchises operated as legitimate NFC threats. Their meetings frequently influenced postseason positioning, transforming divisional contests into conference-shaping events. A defining illustration occurred on October 23, 2016, when the teams finished 6-6 after overtime in a nationally televised game. The contest featured extended defensive pressure, stalled drives, and multiple missed field goals in the extra period. The stalemate captured the physical strain and narrow margins that characterized their clashes during that era. It also underscored how evenly matched the rosters had become at their peaks. Additional chapters reinforced stakes. Arizona's 2015 sweep of Seattle contributed to a 13-3 campaign and division control, while in other seasons, the Seahawks secured titles at the Cardinals' expense. Head-to-head outcomes repeatedly shaped playoff seeding. Geographic contrast, the Pacific Northwest versus the Arizona desert, adds regional flavor, but competitive balance during the mid-2010s remains the rivalry's defining feature. Ray Carruth. Ray Carruth's legal system penalty stemmed from a murder-for-hire plot targeting Cherika Adams, who was pregnant with his child. On November 16, 1999, Adams was shot multiple times while driving in Charlotte, North Carolina. The state's attorneys argued that Carruth arranged the attack and positioned his vehicle in front of hers to slow traffic, allowing a second car carrying the shooter to pull alongside. Adams survived long enough to identify Carruth and describe the incident before dying weeks later. Their son survived but suffered permanent medical complications after oxygen deprivation during the attack. Carruth stood the judicial process in North Carolina on multiple charges connected to the plot. In January 2001, the jury did not convict him of first-degree murder, a crucial legal distinction because that charge could have exposed him to the death penalty. Instead, jurors returned guilty verdicts for conspiracy to commit murder, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and using an instrument to destroy an unborn child. Those convictions still carried severe consequences. At sentencing, the judge issued an indeterminate term of 196 to 245 months for the conspiracy conviction, along with additional penalties from the related charges. Combined, The punishment effectively translated to approximately 18 years and 11 months to 24 years and 4 months under North Carolina's state sentencing structure. Carruth entered the state correctional system immediately after sentencing and remained in custody for nearly 18 years before release from Sampson Correctional Institution on October 22, 2018. Freedom did not occur without restrictions. The ruling also included a 9-month post-release supervision period, requiring monitoring conditions and limiting travel outside North Carolina without authorization. Sam Hurd's incarceration stemmed from a federal narcotics investigation that uncovered plans for a large-scale distribution operation. In 2011, federal agents began monitoring him after receiving intelligence linking him to drug trafficking activity. At the time, he played wide receiver in the NFL, and law enforcement suspected he was attempting to establish a supply network capable of moving major quantities of illegal drugs. The investigation intensified in December 2011 when Undercover Drug Enforcement Administration agents arranged a meeting with Hurd in a Chicago-area restaurant parking lot. During that conversation, he negotiated purchases of 5 to 10 kilograms of cocaine per week and roughly 1,000 pounds of marijuana weekly. Those figures indicated an intended distribution enterprise rather than small-scale possession. Agents arrested him immediately after the meeting and charged him with conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine and marijuana, an offense carrying severe federal penalties. Hurd initially gained release on bond, but the government's case team later reported that he continued communicating with suppliers while under judicial supervision. Those actions violated release conditions, prompting a judge to revoke bond and place him in custody while the case moved forward. In November 2013, he changed strategy and admitted guilt to the conspiracy charge. A federal judge issued the final prison term in August 2015, 180 months of time in jail, equal to 15 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The judge cited the massive scale of the planned drug purchases as the central factor in determining the length of the punishment. He was released in 2023 after federal sentence reductions and good conduct credit shortened the original 15-year term and began the supervision period required by the judgment. Dana Stubblefield's case contains 2 separate phases: the original conviction and judicial penalty, followed by a later appellate ruling that erased both. The underlying accusation stemmed from a 2015 incident in Santa Clara County, California. Government lawyers argued that Stubblefield contacted a woman regarding a babysitting job, brought her to his home, and sexually assaulted her. His defense maintained that the encounter was consensual and involved a financial arrangement. The case ultimately went to the judicial process. In 2020, a jury found him guilty of while acquitting him on a separate charge alleging the victim lacked the capacity to consent. After the verdict, the judge imposed 15 years to life in the California correctional system. That type of punishment is an indeterminate life, meaning the minimum term of 15 years must be served before any parole consideration can occur, rather than guaranteeing release after that period. Stubblefield entered state custody and remained there while his appeal progressed. During that time, he spent nearly 4 years in jail under the original life-term structure, including time at California State Prison in Corcoran. The case shifted dramatically in December 2024, when the California Court of Appeal vacated the conviction. Judges ruled that state lawyers had introduced racially biased arguments during the proceeding, violating the California Racial Justice Act. Because the ruling invalidated the conviction itself, the associated punishment also disappeared. After additional legal proceedings, he was authorized his release in February 2025 under conditions such as electronic monitoring, restrictions on firearms, and no contact with the accuser, while government lawyers considered possible next steps. Dwayne Goodrich's punishment originated from a fatal hit-and-run incident in Dallas in January 2003. 2 men, DeMont Matthews and Joby Wood, had stopped along an interstate to rescue a motorist trapped in a burning vehicle when Goodrich's car struck them at high speed. Both men died, and another individual sustained injuries. Witness testimony later indicated the vehicle was traveling well over 100 miles per hour at the time of the crash. Government lawyers initially pursued 2 manslaughter counts, along with charges for failing to stop and render aid. During the August 2003 hearing, the jury rejected the manslaughter allegations, but returned guilty verdicts for criminally negligent homicide. The vehicle used in the crash was legally classified as a deadly weapon, which affected the sentencing framework. The system imposed 7.5 years of prison time, along with a $20,000 fine. The legal consequences did not end there. Separate proceedings addressed the decision to flee the scene without assisting the victims. After the homicide conviction was affirmed on appeal, a judge imposed 3 5-year terms for failing to stop and render aid. Those terms ran concurrently, meaning they added 5 additional years rather than 15. The concurrent sentences meant the 7.5-year term controlled the total sentence length. Goodrich began serving the custodial portion in 2005, after a period released on bond during the appeal process. After spending about 6 years behind bars, he gained parole in October 2011 and continued under supervision for the remainder of the sentence period. Leonard Little. Leonard Little's legal case originated from a fatal drunk driving collision in St. Louis on October 24, 1998. At the time, he played defensive end for the St. Louis Rams. After consuming alcohol, Little drove his vehicle across the center line and collided with another car. The other driver, 47-year-old Susan Gutweiler, suffered fatal injuries. Investigators determined that Little had been intoxicated, with blood alcohol levels above the legal threshold, and alcohol impairment played a direct role in the crash. The case carried additional weight because earlier that same year, Little had already faced a driving while intoxicated arrest. State lawyers charged him with involuntary manslaughter, a felony tied to causing death through reckless or negligent behavior. Instead of taking the case through a full trial, Little entered a guilty plea to the charge. In 1999, the bench imposed 90 days of detention and 4 years of probation. Although the custodial term appeared short for a fatal crash, the judgment included several strict conditions. Little had to complete 1,000 hours of community service, participate in alcohol treatment programs, and remain under close probation supervision. Many of the service hours involved speaking to young audiences about the consequences of impaired driving. The legal scrutiny continued in April 2004, when Little was arrested again for driving while intoxicated in St. Louis, with a blood alcohol level reportedly more than twice the legal limit. He admitted guilt to that offense and received 2 additional years of probation. The earlier manslaughter incarceration itself remained unchanged, leaving the original 90-day imprisonment as the only custodial portion tied to the fatal crash. Josh Brent. Josh Brent's case centered on a fatal drunk driving crash that occurred on December 8, 2012, near Irving, Texas. Brent was driving with Dallas Cowboys teammate Jerry Brown Jr. in the passenger seat. Law enforcement later concluded that Brent had been traveling at extremely high speed. Reports estimated roughly 110 miles per hour before losing control. The car flipped several times, ejecting Brown from the vehicle and causing fatal injuries. Officers at the scene determined Brent had been drinking. Blood alcohol testing measured 0.18, more than double the legal limit in Texas. Lawyers for the government charged him with intoxication manslaughter, a felony offense involving death caused by impaired driving. The case proceeded to hearing, and in July 2013, a jury returned a guilty verdict. During the sentencing phase, the judge imposed a 10-year jail term, but Texas law allowed the judge to suspend that term and place Brent under community supervision instead. The judge selected that option, restructuring the punishment as 10 years of probation plus 180 days in county jail as a condition of the probation term. Brent served the 6-month custodial period before beginning probation. The situation shifted again in 2015, when Brent admitted violating probation rules, including alcohol-related violations. Because probation had been broken, the judicial system revoked it and activated additional punishment. the judge ordered another 180 days in state custody after Brent failed drug tests, after which Brent gained release while still facing the lasting legal consequences of the intoxication manslaughter conviction. Tank Johnson. Tank Johnson's time behind bars resulted from weapons offenses connected to events in Chicago between 2004 and 2006. The legal situation began in 2004 when Johnson was arrested for possessing a firearm without the required license. Instead of imposing immediate incarceration, he was placed on probation, meaning he had to avoid further violations and comply with court supervision. In December 2005, Chicago police executed a search at Johnson's home during an investigation into suspected illegal weapons possession. Officers recovered multiple firearms, including rifles and handguns. Because Johnson remained under tribunal supervision from the earlier case, government lawyers argued that possessing those weapons violated the conditions of his probation. Johnson later admitted guilt to the probation violation. In January 2006, the judiciary imposed 120 days in Cook County Jail, followed by 18 months of additional probation after release. The prison term was served in a county facility rather than a state penitentiary, which is why the case is often described as a jail term rather than a longer prison term. The legal issues gained wider attention later that year when Johnson was present at a nightclub where a member of his security group was shot and killed. Although lead detectives did not charge him with that homicide, the incident intensified scrutiny around his earlier weapons violations. Johnson ultimately completed the 120-day jail penalty and continued his professional career afterward. Johnny Jolly. Johnny Jolly served prison time in Texas because of a drug investigation tied to codeine-based cough syrup, a substance commonly abused for recreational purposes. In July 2008, police stopped Jolly during a traffic encounter in Houston. During a search of his vehicle, officers discovered several bottles containing large quantities of codeine syrup. Authorities concluded that the amount exceeded what would normally indicate personal use. He was charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver, a felony under Texas law. The legal proceedings stretched across several years. While awaiting trial, Jolly remained under supervision, but encountered additional problems when drug tests indicated continued codeine use. Because of those violations, a judge revoked his bond and placed him in custody while the case continued. In 2012, Jolly admitted guilt to the felony charge. He was given 6 years in the Texas correctional system. That ruling reflected both the drug trafficking charge and the violations that occurred while the case was pending. However, the full 6-year term did not unfold as originally imposed. After roughly 6 months in custody, the judge reconsidered the structure of the punishment and transferred Jolly into a court-ordered residential drug treatment program. The modification allowed him to leave jail in May 2013 while completing rehabilitation as part of his probation conditions. Nate Newton. Nate Newton was involved in 2 separate marijuana trafficking arrests that led to his arrest. The first stop happened in November 2001 in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, where lead detectives discovered about 213 pounds of marijuana in a van Newton was driving. Roughly 5 weeks later, another traffic stop took place in Texas, where officers uncovered an additional 175 pounds of marijuana. The close timing and large quantities significantly increased the seriousness of the legal situation. Newton eventually admitted guilt in the federal case connected to the Texas arrest. In April 2002, he pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges involving distribution quantities of marijuana. Under federal law, the offense carried a potential maximum penalty of 20 years, along with heavy financial penalties. In August 2002, a federal judge imposed 30 months of time in custody, equal to 2.5 years, along with a $50,000 fine and 3 years of supervised release after completion of the custodial term. That federal ruling represented the primary punishment connected to the case. The earlier Louisiana arrest also produced a separate 5-year judicial penalty, but the judge ordered it to run concurrently with the federal term. Because both ran at the same time rather than consecutively, The 30-month federal punishment effectively determined the total length of the time Newton stayed in jail. Mark Ingram Sr. Mark Ingram Sr.'s case originated from a federal financial crime investigation involving bank fraud and money laundering. He was accused of participating in schemes that included cashing counterfeit checks and laundering funds he thought were tied to drug proceeds. He admitted guilt to the charges in 2005, but the sentencing phase stretched over several years due to legal disputes, attempts to withdraw the plea, and missed hearings. The federal court finally issued its judgment in September 2008. The verdict included 92 months of jail time, which equals 7 years and 8 months, along with an order to pay $252,000 in restitution. That figure represents the official punishment tied to the fraud and money laundering convictions. The case then took another turn when Ingram failed to report to custody on the assigned surrender date. District officials determined that he had skipped the reporting requirement, triggering a separate legal action for failing to surrender. In March 2010, he received 2 additional years because of that violation. As a result, what initially appeared as a sentence slightly longer than 7 years expanded to roughly 9 years of total exposure once the additional penalty for failing to report was imposed. Darrell Henley. Darrell Henley's case escalated far beyond a typical narcotics prosecution because it eventually included an attempted assassination plot targeting a federal judge. Henley, a cornerback for the Los Angeles Rams during the early 1990s, came under investigation in 1995 when federal investigators connected him to a cocaine trafficking network operating in California. Surveillance operations and informant testimony linked him to transporting and distributing significant quantities of the drug, leading to federal charges for conspiracy and trafficking. While the narcotics allegations alone carried severe penalties, the situation intensified after Henley was taken into federal custody awaiting a legal case. State lawyers later revealed that he attempted to hire someone he thought was a contract killer to eliminate the judge assigned to his case, along with several government witnesses. The individual approached by Henley was actually an undercover federal agent, and recorded conversations captured discussions about the planned killings. Those recordings formed the basis for additional federal charges involving attempted murder of a protected official and witness intimidation. When the case reached trial, the jury convicted Henley on the drug trafficking conspiracy as well as the charges connected to the murder plot. Attempting to arrange the killing of a federal judge carries extraordinary legal consequences because judges are classified as protected federal officials. In 1996, he received life imprisonment within the federal correctional system. The permanent ruling reflected the combination of large-scale cocaine trafficking and the plot to assassinate a federal judge and potential witnesses. Without parole provisions under modern federal sentencing law, the punishment effectively ensured Henley would remain in jail for the rest of his life unless the conviction were overturned or commuted. Eric Naposki. Eric Naposki was involved in a murder case that remained unresolved for more than a decade before investigators convicted him. Naposki, who had briefly played professional football during the late 1980s and early 1990s, was eventually linked to the 1994 killing of businessman William McLaughlin in Newport Beach, California. McLaughlin was shot at his home in December of that year, and the case initially stalled without an arrest. Years later, lead detectives concluded the killing had been orchestrated for financial gain. District attorneys argued that McLaughlin's girlfriend, Nanette Johnston, stood to collect millions of dollars from life insurance policies if he died. Officials alleged that Johnston and Naposki were involved romantically and conspired together to carry out the murder, with Johnston arranging circumstances that allowed the attack while Naposki carried out the shooting. After reopening the investigation, officials arrested both suspects in 2009, more than 14 years after the homicide. Naposki faced charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances, specifically murder committed for financial benefit. The case proceeded to court in 2011, where district attorneys presented testimony about the relationship between Johnston and Naposki, along with financial evidence tied to insurance policies. The jury ultimately convicted Naposki of first-degree murder for financial gain. Under California law, that special circumstance allowed the harshest sentencing options, and the bench imposed life in jail without the possibility of parole. That ruling means he will remain imprisoned permanently unless an appellate bench overturns the conviction. Johnston received a similar life sentence for her role in the conspiracy. Will Allen. Allen co-founded an investment firm called Capital Financial Partners with business partner Susan Daub after his stint in the NFL. Beginning around 2012, prosecutors said the company promoted high-interest lending opportunities, supposedly designed to provide short-term loans to professional athletes facing temporary financial shortages. Investors were promised strong returns, often around 10%, based on claims that the loans were secured by athlete contracts and other financial guarantees. Federal lead detectives later determined the program did not function as advertised. Instead, incoming funds were frequently used to pay earlier investors in Ponzi-style payouts, support personal spending, and maintain the illusion of a profitable lending operation. Detectives arrested Allen and Daub in 2018 and charged them with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Rather than contest the allegations at trial, Allen admitted guilt to the conspiracy charge in November 2018, acknowledging that investors had been misled about how their money would be used. During sentencing in May 2019, the tribunal considered the total financial losses suffered by victims, the number of individuals affected, and Allen's leadership role within the operation. The judge imposed 72 months of incarceration, equal to 6 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The ruling also required more than $16.8 million in restitution to compensate victims of the fraud scheme. Clint Session. Clint Session was convicted because of a federal tax fraud case involving false filings submitted to the Internal Revenue Service. Detectives began investigating him in connection with a scheme that generated fraudulent tax refunds through inaccurate financial reporting. District attorneys stated that Session participated in preparing and filing returns containing fabricated income figures and other misleading information designed to trigger refunds that were not legally owed. The investigation determined that the scheme involved submitting multiple fraudulent filings and manipulating personal financial details to increase refund amounts. The case moved through federal hearings, where Session ultimately admitted guilt to conspiracy to commit tax fraud, rather than contesting the allegations at hearing. During the sentencing process, the judge reviewed the scale of the false refund claims, Session's involvement in preparing the filings, and the extent of his cooperation with lead detectives. In 2017, he was given 5 years probation plus 1 year prison. The judgment also required repayment of the fraudulent refunds, making restitution to the federal government a formal part of the punishment. Lawrence Phillips. Lawrence Phillips ended up spending years in prison after a violent assault case in California in which a vehicle was used as the weapon. In January 2005, Phillips confronted 3 teenagers in Los Angeles following an argument. Government attorneys argued that he deliberately drove his car into the group, striking 2 of them and causing serious injuries. Detectives charged Phillips with multiple felonies, including assault with a deadly weapon and inflicting great bodily injury. Under California law, a vehicle qualifies as a deadly weapon when used intentionally to harm someone. The case went to criminal proceedings, and in 2008, a jury convicted Phillips on several of the assault-related charges. The sentencing phase considered both the severity of the attack and Phillips's prior criminal record. Because of those earlier convictions, the case fell under California's 3 strikes law, which dramatically increases penalties for repeat felony offenders. The judge imposed 31 years in the California correctional system. While serving that term, Phillips later faced another homicide allegation after detectives accused him of killing his cellmate at Kern Valley State Prison in 2015. Before the murder case could proceed, Phillips was found dead in his cell in January 2016. Officials ruled the death a suicide. Dexter Manley. Dexter Manley's time behind bars followed a pattern of drug-related offenses that surfaced after his NFL career concluded. During his time in professional football, he had already faced league suspensions connected to substance abuse violations, particularly involving cocaine. After football ended, the issue shifted from league discipline to criminal prosecution. In 1995, authorities in Houston arrested Manley for possession of cocaine. Early in the case, the judge ordered probation, giving him a chance to stay out of prison if he complied with a series of strict requirements. Those conditions included regular drug testing, participation in treatment programs, and supervision by the legal system. Manley failed to meet those requirements. In 1996, officials determined that he had violated probation through failed drug tests and failure to comply with treatment directives. Because those violations demonstrated non-compliance with the earlier order, the judge revoked the probation. After revocation, he received 4 years of incarceration within the Texas correctional system. Manley did not serve the entire term, gaining release after roughly 15 months under parole eligibility rules. Following his release, he entered long-term recovery programs and later spoke publicly about addiction and rehabilitation. Alonzo Spellman. Spellman, a first-round NFL draft selection, struggled with mental health challenges throughout his career, including bipolar disorder. Those issues formed part of the background to several legal incidents. In 1996, authorities responded to reports of a violent dispute involving Spellman and his girlfriend. Government attorneys alleged that during the confrontation, he threatened the victim with a firearm and physically assaulted her. Police recovered the weapon during the investigation and placed Spellman under arrest. He faced felony charges, including felonious assault and domestic violence, with the firearm element increasing the seriousness of the case. After legal proceedings, the judiciary convicted Spellman on the assault-related charges. Spellman served 18 months probation and treatment. Mental health evaluations during and after the case confirmed that Spellman suffered from bipolar disorder, which became part of discussions surrounding treatment and supervision after his release. He completed the custodial portion of the sentence before leaving state custody. Brandon Browner. Brandon Browner ended up in prison after a violent domestic attack that took place in July 2018 in Laverne, California. At the time, Browner had already faced previous legal trouble and was under a restraining order prohibiting contact with the victim, a former girlfriend. Prosecuting attorneys stated that he forced entry into her home despite that order and launched a prolonged assault once inside. Lead detectives said the attack involved choking, dragging the victim through the residence, and repeated threats to kill her. The most serious allegation centered on Browner attempting to suffocate the victim by pressing a carpet over her face. Those actions formed the basis of the attempted murder charge that later drove the sentencing outcome. Following his arrest, prosecutors filed several felony counts, including attempted murder, burglary, false imprisonment, domestic violence, and violation of a restraining order. Rather than proceed with the case, Browner entered a no-contest plea to attempted murder in December 2018. That plea allowed the judicial process to treat the case as a conviction while resolving the remaining charges without a jury trial. The judge imposed 8 years in the California State Correctional System, with supervision conditions scheduled to follow release. The attempted murder conviction carried the most significant weight in determining the punishment and effectively ended Browner's professional football career. Stanley Wilson Jr. Stanley Wilson Jr., a former Detroit Lions cornerback, received a lengthy sentence following a series of unusual burglary incidents in Portland, Oregon. In 2016, police began investigating reports that a man had been entering private homes unclothed during late-night break-ins. The investigative team eventually identified Wilson as the suspect. Residents reported finding him wandering through their homes after entering through unlocked doors or windows. Although the incidents did not involve physical violence, public prosecutors argued that repeatedly entering occupied residences created significant danger and fear for the homeowners. Authorities charged Wilson with first-degree burglary, along with additional trespassing-related offenses. During proceedings, he underwent mental health evaluations and medical professionals determined he struggled with serious psychological conditions. Despite those concerns, a ruling was made that he remained competent to stand the case proceedings. The proceedings wrapped up in 2017 with a ruling that placed him in Oregon's correctional system for 10 to 25 years. The ruling emphasized the repeated nature of the burglaries and the risks created when residents encountered an intruder inside their homes. Dante Stallworth. Dante Stallworth's case originated from a fatal impaired driving crash in Miami Beach on March 14, 2009. Earlier that night, Stallworth had been drinking at a nightclub before driving his Bentley along the MacArthur Causeway. During the drive, his vehicle struck Mario Reyes, a construction worker crossing the road after finishing a night shift. Federal agents conducted blood testing after the collision and recorded a blood alcohol concentration of 0.126, above Florida's legal limit of 0.08. Because the crash resulted in a death, prosecuting attorneys charged Stallworth with DUI manslaughter, a felony offense that can carry up to 15 years of incarceration. Instead of taking the case to the judge, Stallworth entered a guilty plea. Several factors shaped the plea agreement, including his cooperation with investigators and a civil financial settlement reached with the victim's family. In June 2009, he was handed a sentence of 30 days in county jail, 2 years of house arrest, 8 years of probation, and permanent revocation of his driver's license. Stallworth served the jail term in Miami-Dade County before completing the house arrest portion under electronic monitoring. Eugene Robinson. Eugene Robinson's legal case differed from many other NFL incidents because it involved a misdemeanor offense rather than a serious felony. Robinson, a veteran safety for the Atlanta Falcons at the time, was arrested in Miami on January 30, 1999, less than 24 hours before Super Bowl 33. Police reported that Robinson approached a woman who was actually an undercover officer posing as a prostitute. During the encounter, he offered money in exchange for a sexual act. Officers immediately arrested him and charged him with solicitation of prostitution, a misdemeanor under Florida law. The arrest drew intense attention because it occurred during Super Bowl week. Only days earlier, Robinson had received the Bart Starr Award, which recognizes character and leadership among NFL players. Robinson quickly resolved the case by entering a no-contest plea. He received a fine and 1 night in jail, which was already satisfied by the time he spent in custody immediately after the arrest. Titus Young. Titus Young's legal situation unfolded through multiple arrests and mental health proceedings rather than a single criminal episode. In May 2013, authorities in Moreno Valley, California, arrested Young on suspicion of driving under the influence after he attempted to drive away from officers during a traffic stop. Only days later, police arrested him again for residential burglary after he allegedly entered a house he had previously lived in and attempted to remove property. Within the same week, he faced a third arrest connected to another break-in that escalated into a confrontation with the homeowner, adding assault allegations to the case. Because of concerns about Young's mental health, psychiatric evaluations during the proceedings were carried out. In 2014, a judge ruled that he was not mentally competent to stand hearing at that time, resulting in placement within a treatment facility instead of immediate incarceration. After several years of evaluations and legal reviews, Young eventually entered a no-contest plea to a burglary-related offense. He was handed 4 years in the California State Correctional System, ending a prolonged legal process that had been shaped by both criminal charges and ongoing mental health litigation. Ray Rice. Ray Rice did not receive a custodial ruling following the 2014 domestic violence case in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The incident occurred on February 15, 2014, inside an elevator at the Revel Casino involving Rice and his then-fiancée, Janae Palmer. Surveillance footage captured Rice striking Palmer during the altercation, leaving her unconscious before he dragged her from the elevator. State lawyers charged Rice with third-degree aggravated assault, a felony offense in New Jersey that carries a potential penalty of up to 5 years of detention. Instead of proceeding to court, Rice applied for admission into the state's Pretrial Intervention Program, PTI, a diversion program designed for certain first-time offenders. The judicial system approved Rice's participation in the program. The conditions required domestic violence counseling, anger management treatment, and supervised monitoring for approximately 12 months. Successful completion of PTI allows the defendant to avoid formal conviction. Rice completed all program requirements, and the aggravated assault charge was dismissed. Ultimately, the legal process did not send him to jail. Despite the legal outcome, the incident led to the termination of his contract with the Baltimore Ravens and a suspension from the NFL that effectively ended his playing career. Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez's punishment stemmed from 2 separate criminal proceedings, though many summaries combined them. The first and most consequential case involved the June 2013 killing of Odin Lloyd. On April 15, 2015, a Massachusetts jury returned a verdict of first-degree murder, along with related firearm and ammunition violations. Under Massachusetts law, that conviction automatically triggers the most severe penalty available in the state system: life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole. Once the jury reached that conclusion, the judge had no authority to reduce or modify the penalty. The prosecution argued that Hernandez and 2 associates picked Lloyd up, transported him to an industrial park near Hernandez's home, and shot him multiple times. Law enforcement presented surveillance recordings, text messages, shell casings, and testimony that tied Hernandez to the location and the weapon used in the killing. Because the jury classified the offense as first-degree murder rather than second-degree, the legal outcome carried the mandatory maximum punishment allowed in Massachusetts. A second criminal proceeding unfolded in 2017, involving the 2012 shooting deaths of Daniel De Abreu and Safiro Furtado in Boston. During that legal proceedings, Hernandez was acquitted of the homicide charges, but jurors still convicted him of unlawful possession of a firearm connected to the incident. That conviction carried an additional 4 to 5 year term concurrent, though the extra penalty had little practical effect because the Lloyd case had already imposed permanent incarceration. Hernandez remained in state custody under the life without parole sentence when he died on April 19, 2017. His death occurred before the appeal process finished, which temporarily triggered an old Massachusetts rule that erased convictions if a defendant died before appeals concluded. The state's highest legal system later eliminated that rule in 2019 and reinstated the Lloyd conviction, leaving the historical record clear. Hernandez received a life sentence without parole for the Lloyd murder, with an additional firearms penalty from the Boston case. Jim Tyrer. Jim Tyrer's case involved homicide, but never resulted in criminal prosecution because the offender died at the scene. Tyrer had been a dominant offensive lineman for the Kansas City Chiefs during the franchise's championship era, including the team that won Super Bowl IV. After his playing career ended in the mid-1970s, several business ventures collapsed, leaving him in severe financial distress. By 1980, Tyrer faced heavy debts and mounting pressure from creditors. Friends later reported that his financial situation had deteriorated rapidly and that he had grown increasingly withdrawn. On September 15, 1980, authorities responded to the Tyrer residence in Kansas City after relatives became concerned when they could not reach the family. Investigators determined that Tyrer shot and killed his wife, Martha Tyrer, using a handgun inside their home. After the shooting, he turned the weapon on himself and died by suicide. Because the suspect died immediately after the homicide, there was no criminal filing. Law enforcement closed the investigation as a murder-suicide, meaning the case never entered the legal system. Thomas Johnson. The events that ultimately sent Thomas Johnson to prison began with a fatal impaired driving crash in Tempe, Arizona in June 2008. Johnson, a former defensive tackle who played for the Minnesota Vikings and Arizona Cardinals, was driving when his vehicle crossed into oncoming traffic and struck another car head-on. The driver of the other vehicle suffered fatal injuries. After the crash, police conducted blood testing at a hospital and determined Johnson's blood alcohol level was well above Arizona's legal limit. Because the collision caused a death and involved intoxicated driving, prosecutors charged him with vehicular manslaughter and driving under the influence. Johnson chose to resolve the case through a guilty plea, moving the proceedings directly to sentencing. The fatal outcome of the crash, Johnson's level of intoxication, and the circumstances surrounding the collision was reviewed by the judiciary, and the proceedings ended with a decision placing him in the Arizona Department of Corrections for 8 years. Johnson entered state custody to serve the punishment tied to the vehicular homicide conviction. Nate Webster. Nate Webster's sexual offense involving a minor investigation began in 2011 in Ohio, when authorities in Hamilton County examined allegations that Webster had engaged in sexual activity with a teenage girl who was below the legal age of consent. Prosecuting attorneys also alleged he attempted to discourage the victim from revealing the relationship. A grand jury later issued indictments covering several charges, including unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, sexual battery, and gross sexual imposition. Legal proceedings started in 2012. During the proceedings, the victim testified about the relationship, while prosecutors presented evidence supporting the allegations. After deliberation, the jury delivered a mixed verdict. Webster was convicted on 4 counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, but acquitted on several other charges, including sexual battery. Sentencing, therefore, relied solely on the counts upheld by the jury. The case reached its sentencing phase in June 2012, when he was ordered to serve 10 to 12 years in Ohio's state prison system, but he actually served around 6 years. Webster later appealed the ruling, and in 2013, an appellate bench vacated one of the convictions after determining that prosecuting attorneys had not sufficiently proven the victim's age for that count. Following resentencing, the punishment was reduced to 10 years. Michael Vick. Michael Vick's confinement resulted from a federal investigation into an organized dogfighting operation connected to property he owned in Surry County, Virginia. In April 2007, detectives executed a search warrant at the rural property and uncovered extensive evidence tied to illegal animal fighting. Investigators located dozens of pit bulls, training equipment, fighting pits stained with blood, and burial sites containing dead animals. Federal prosecutors concluded the site functioned as the base for a dogfighting operation called Bad News Kennels, active for several years. Evidence gathered during the investigation described a structured enterprise run by Vick and 3 associates. Officials documented dogs being trained specifically for fighting competitions, organized events held on the property, and gambling tied to those matches. State lawyers also presented evidence showing that animals that failed to perform were sometimes killed through various methods. Because the activities involved interstate travel and organized gambling, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. A federal grand jury issued indictments in July 2007, charging Vick and his associates with conspiracy to travel in interstate commerce in aid of unlawful activities and to sponsor a dog in an animal fighting venture. Initially, Vick denied direct involvement. As 2 co-defendants began cooperating with the prosecutions and additional evidence surfaced, he shifted legal strategy and entered a guilty plea in August 2007 to the federal conspiracy charge. In December 2007, a federal judge imposed a punishment of 23 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered nearly $1 million in restitution to help cover the rehabilitation and care of the seized dogs. Vick entered federal custody in early 2008 and served roughly 18 months before completing the remainder of the term in a halfway house under supervision. He regained freedom in 2009 after completing the custodial portion of the penalty. Plaxico Burress. Plaxico Burress faced criminal charges after a firearm discharged inside a Manhattan nightclub during the 2008 NFL season. On November 28, 2008, Burress visited the Latin Quarter, carrying a loaded .40 caliber Glock tucked into the waistband of his sweatpants. The weapon slipped and discharged, sending a bullet through his thigh. The injury itself was not life-threatening, but the circumstances immediately triggered a police investigation because New York maintained extremely strict gun possession laws. Federal agents determined that several legal violations had occurred. The weapon was loaded. Burris did not possess a valid New York concealed carry permit, and the firearm had been carried inside a public venue. Under the state's gun statutes at the time, criminal possession of a loaded firearm constituted a serious felony offense. A grand jury later indicted him on 2 felony counts tied to the illegal weapon. Facing mandatory sentencing exposure if the case proceeded to hearing, Burris entered negotiations with the state's legal team. In August 2009, he accepted a plea agreement and admitted guilt to attempted criminal possession of a weapon. The deal avoided a longer hearing process, but still required a custodial penalty under state law. The judiciary imposed 2 years of jail time plus 2 years of post-release supervision. Due to credit for good conduct, Burris served roughly 20 months at Oneida Correctional Facility, a medium-security institution in upstate New York. In June 2011, he was released and entered the supervision period required by the ruling, which placed monitoring conditions similar to probation. Darren Sharper. Darren Sharper's case developed into a complex multi-jurisdiction prosecution involving both federal officials and the judicial system. Law enforcement accused him of drugging women and committing sexual assaults in Louisiana, California, Arizona, and Nevada. The government's case team argued that Sharper and associates secretly administered sedatives such as alprazolam, diazepam, and zolpidem to incapacitate victims before assaults occurred. Because the conduct involved distributing controlled substances across jurisdictions, federal investigators led the central prosecution in Louisiana. In that federal case, Sharper admitted guilt to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances with intent to commit sexual assault, and 2 additional counts tied to distributing those drugs. Parallel agreements resolved related charges in other states involving several victims. The plea structure allowed the federal court to examine a wider pattern of misconduct during sentencing, including accusations that extended beyond the specific counts in the agreement. Originally, negotiations suggested a far shorter punishment, roughly 9 years. However, the presiding federal judge rejected that outcome, concluding it did not reflect the scale of the crimes. In August 2016, the judiciary imposed 220 months of federal confinement, followed by 3 years of supervised release and a $20,000 fine. That figure equals 18 years and 4 months, which is why summaries typically describe the case as an 18-year federal punishment. A California judge later issued a 20-year state imprisonment connected to assaults there, closing the remaining prosecutions. While that penalty carried potential parole eligibility under California rules, the longer federal term remained the controlling factor shaping Sharper's confinement timeline. The final outcome therefore reflected both the federal conviction and the additional state punishment within the multi-state case. Kellen Winslow II. Kellen Winslow II faced criminal prosecution in California after multiple women accused him of sexual offenses spanning several years. The investigation began in 2018 when police in Encinitas arrested him following allegations that he assaulted a 54-year-old homeless woman. As detectives examined the case, additional accusations surfaced involving other women, including elderly victims. The government lawyers eventually filed numerous felony counts covering kidnapping, lewd conduct, indecent exposure, and burglary connected to the incidents. The first hearing started in May 2019 and produced mixed results. Jurors returned guilty verdicts involving the homeless woman and 2 counts of indecent exposure, while acquitting him on several other charges. They could not reach decisions on additional counts, creating a mistrial on those unresolved accusations. With several charges still pending, state lawyers prepared for a second hearing. Facing the possibility of further convictions and a significantly longer punishment, Winslow accepted a negotiated resolution in 2020. Under that agreement, He admitted guilt to multiple felony offenses, including forcible assault with intent to commit and indecent exposure. In March 2021, a California judge imposed the final punishment, 14 years of confinement in the state system, plus 8 months credit adjustments. The court ruling reflected both the rape conviction from the original legal proceedings and the additional counts resolved through the plea agreement. Credit rules within California corrections can shorten the time served through good conduct credits, but the official ruling handed down by the tribunal remained 14 years. David Meggett. After finishing his NFL career, Meggett worked as a running backs coach at a high school in North Myrtle Beach. In 2014, authorities arrested him following a complaint from a woman who stated that he forced sexual intercourse during a meeting at a hotel. Prosecuting attorneys charged Meggett with first-degree criminal sexual conduct, a serious felony under South Carolina law. The victim testified that the encounter occurred despite her repeated objections. Meggett's defense argued that the interaction had been consensual, creating the central dispute during the trial. The case went before a jury in 2017. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence, jurors returned a guilty verdict on the first-degree criminal sexual conduct charge. Because the offense involves forced sexual activity, the statute carries extremely severe sentencing ranges. The proceedings ended with a decision that placed him in South Carolina's prison system for 30 years. The conviction also required mandatory sex offender registration, which remains in effect after release. Cecil Collins. 2 criminal cases, separated by several years, ultimately shaped the legal outcome that put Cecil Collins behind bars. The first major incident took place in 1992 while Collins attended Louisiana State University. Authorities arrested him after a woman reported that he entered her apartment without permission and sexually assaulted her after she woke up and discovered him inside. Prosecutors charged Collins with burglary of an inhabited dwelling and sexual battery. He was convicted in Louisiana State and received 5 years of jail time. After serving several years, he gained release and later attempted to rebuild his football career, eventually signing with the Miami Dolphins in 1999. Later that same year, Collins was arrested again in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, after case officials linked him to a series of residential burglaries involving apartments occupied by women. In one case, a resident discovered him inside her home, prompting police to connect him to additional break-ins. Because Collins already had a prior violent felony conviction, the sentencing phase carried greater weight. In 2000, a Florida court imposed 15 years of incarceration for the burglary and sexual battery convictions, citing the earlier sexual assault case and the repeated pattern of unlawful entry into occupied homes. Ezekiel Elliott, 2017, domestic violence suspension. In 2017, Ezekiel Elliott became the center of a disciplinary dispute that exposed a complicated tension inside professional football. The league's power to punish athletes, even when the criminal justice system declines to act. Elliott had entered the NFL only a year earlier as the 4th overall selection in the 2016 draft, and quickly developed into the centerpiece of Dallas's offense, leading the NFL in rushing during his rookie season. While his performance on the field drew national attention, allegations of domestic violence involving a former partner began to surface during the summer of 2016. Police in Columbus, Ohio, examined multiple incidents reported to have occurred that July. Local authorities ultimately chose not to pursue criminal charges. According to statements from the Columbus City Attorney's Office, prosecutors determined the available evidence did not meet the threshold required for a criminal conviction. In many professional sports, that decision would have effectively ended the matter. The NFL, however, operates under a personal conduct policy that allows discipline based on its own internal review. As a result, the conference conducted a lengthy inquiry that included interviews with the accuser, Elliott, and other witnesses, while investigators examined medical records, text messages, and various accounts connected to the allegations. After more than a year of examination, the NFL announced its decision in August 2017. Commissioner Roger Goodell imposed a 6-game suspension, explaining that the league's review had identified substantial and persuasive evidence indicating Elliott had committed multiple acts of physical violence during the 2016 incidents. The ruling immediately sparked a complex legal confrontation. Elliott appealed through an internal process and later challenged the punishment in federal court, creating a confusing series of legal developments that temporarily allowed him to continue playing while judges considered the dispute. The legal challenges eventually failed to permanently block the penalty, and in November 2017, the Dallas running back began serving the 6-game suspension. The timing disrupted the Cowboys' season, because the offense had been built heavily around his rushing ability. Beyond the immediate impact on Dallas, the episode triggered a broader debate about the NFL's authority to discipline competitors. Critics argued the association had acted as its own judge and jury, despite the absence of criminal charges, while supporters maintained that professional football must enforce conduct standards independent of the legal system. The Elliott case has since remained a reference point whenever the NFL disciplines professionals for off-field behavior. Mike Webster, brain injury lawsuit pioneer. Mike Webster's story eventually became one of the most important turning points in the history of football safety. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Webster served as the starting center for Pittsburgh during the franchise's dominant era, helping power the Steelers to 4 Super Bowl victories. His durability and toughness became legendary across the competition. On nearly every offensive snap, he collided with opposing linemen, absorbing constant blows while anchoring the line that protected Pittsburgh's offense. At the time, the long-term effects of repeated head impacts were poorly understood. Linemen experienced contact on virtually every play, yet concussions were frequently treated as routine injuries rather than serious neurological events. Players often returned to the field quickly after sustaining blows to the head, and little attention was paid to how thousands of impacts across a career might affect the brain decades later. After stepping away from football in 1990, Webster's life gradually deteriorated. Friends and family later described severe memory loss, depression, mood swings, and erratic behavior. At different points, he struggled with homelessness, reportedly living out of his truck while searching for relief from constant headaches. The contrast between the respected Hall of Fame center and the difficulties he faced later shocked many who had known him during his playing years. When Webster died in 2002 at age 50, a forensic examination conducted by Dr. Bennett Omalu uncovered something extraordinary. Omalu identified chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain condition associated with repeated head trauma. The discovery helped launch a broader medical and legal confrontation surrounding football's long-term health risks. Thousands of former professionals later pursued legal action against the league over neurological damage, eventually leading to a massive settlement that funded medical monitoring and compensation. Webster's decline, therefore, became the symbolic beginning of a movement that forced the sport to confront the consequences of repeated head impacts. Chuck Hughes, on-field death, 1971. On October 24, 1971, a routine NFL game in Detroit suddenly turned into one of the most haunting moments in professional football history. Late in the fourth quarter at Tiger Stadium, Detroit Lions wide receiver Chuck Hughes returned to the huddle after a play and unexpectedly collapsed. At first, squad members on the field appeared unsure what had happened. There had been no violent collision, no obvious injury. Within seconds, however, the situation became alarmingly clear. Something far more serious was unfolding. Medical personnel rushed onto the field and began emergency treatment, while the atmosphere inside the stadium shifted from confusion to silence. Squad mates and opponents stood nearby watching the effort unfold. Chicago linebacker Dick Butkus quickly recognized the severity of the situation and urgently signaled toward the sideline for help. As doctors continued working to restore a pulse, thousands of spectators watched anxiously, unsure whether the young receiver would recover. Hughes was transported by ambulance to Henry Ford Hospital, but physicians were unable to revive him. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward at just 28 years old. A later autopsy revealed advanced coronary artery disease, including a coronary artery that was nearly completely blocked. Medical examiners concluded that a fatal heart attack had likely struck during the game. The tragedy stunned the conference and remains historically unique. Hughes is still the only NFL player to die during an active contest. At the time, sides returned to the field and completed the final minutes of the matchup, which Detroit won 28-23, a decision that later sparked debate because modern protocols would almost certainly suspend play after such an emergency. The event ultimately pushed professional football towards stronger cardiovascular screening for athletes, but the image of players standing silently while doctors fought to save Hughes remains one of the sport's most haunting scenes. New Orleans Saints, Catholic Church email controversy. In early 2020, the New Orleans Saints became connected to an issue far removed from the playing field. The situation centered on the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New Orleans, which was preparing to release a list of priests credibly accused of sexual abuse. That announcement carried enormous weight across the city, where Catholic institutions hold deep cultural influence. As the Archdiocese prepared its public statements, internal communications later revealed that members of the Saints' public relations department had been involved in discussions about how the release might be presented. Emails later obtained through reporting by the Associated Press showed that members of the organization's public relations department exchanged messages with church officials during the preparation process. Those communications indicated that team representatives reviewed draft statements and offered suggestions about wording before the list became public. Some recommendations focused on emphasizing themes such as healing and repentance in the messaging surrounding the announcement. When the emails surfaced publicly, critics immediately questioned why a professional football franchise had become involved in communications related to a clergy abuse scandal. The Saints have long maintained strong ties with Catholic institutions in New Orleans, and owner Gail Benson is known for her close relationship with the Archdiocese. Even so, the discovery of those exchanges created concern that influential sports establishments had participated in shaping how the church addressed a highly sensitive issue. Outfit representatives later responded by explaining that their involvement was intended to encourage transparency rather than protect church leadership. According to the franchise, executives advised officials to release the full list and avoid minimizing the seriousness of the allegations. Despite that explanation, the episode generated national headlines and sparked debate about the role powerful civic institutions can play in managing public messaging during major scandals. Las Vegas Raiders, Al Davis antitrust lawsuit. One of the most important legal battles in professional football history began when Raiders owner Al Davis challenged authorities over franchise movement. During the late 1970s, Davis attempted to relocate the Oakland Raiders to Los Angeles, arguing that the group could operate more successfully in a larger market. At the time, however, NFL rules required approval from other owners before a franchise could move to a new city. When Davis formally announced plans to play at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum in 1980, the other owners voted against the proposal. Rather than accept that decision, Davis responded with a federal antitrust lawsuit against the officials in power. His legal argument claimed that the relocation restrictions violated competition laws by preventing cities from fairly competing to host professional football teams. The dispute quickly escalated into a bitter confrontation between Davis and the leadership, particularly Commissioner Pete Rozelle. Court proceedings stretched over several years, while tensions among ownership groups intensified. Eventually, in 1982, a federal jury ruled in favor of Davis and the Raiders, determining that the league's relocation rules violated antitrust law. The ruling dramatically altered the balance of power between individual franchises and the people in power. With the legal victory secured, the Raiders relocated to Los Angeles later that year. The decision weakened the NFL's ability to block future moves and influenced several relocations during the following decades. Davis's courtroom victory ultimately reshaped how professional football handled franchise movement across the country. Houston Texans, owner comment controversy, 2017. In 2017, professional football was already facing intense public debate over player demonstrations during the national anthem. The protests, originally sparked by quarterback Colin Kaepernick, aimed to highlight concerns about racial inequality and police brutality in the United States. By that season, the demonstrations had spread across multiple outfits and become one of the most discussed issues surrounding the sport. Within that charged atmosphere, a remark made by Houston Texans owner Bob McNair triggered a new public reaction. During an owners' meeting, McNair reportedly said that the NFL could not allow the inmates to run the prison. When the comment later became public through media reports, it immediately generated backlash across the conference. Many critics interpreted the phrase as racially insensitive because the majority of NFL professionals are black, while nearly all owners are white. Inside the Texans organization, several members reportedly considered boycotting games in response to the statement. Team meetings were held to address the issue, as athletes expressed frustration and disappointment regarding the remark. McNair later issued a public apology, stating that his words had been poorly chosen and did not reflect his intended meaning. Despite that response, the incident highlighted a growing divide between those advocating for social change and the executives responsible for managing the league's image.